You wake before the heat has a chance to rise, while the dust still lies quiet on the street like a thin quilt no one wants to shake. The lanes are narrow and softly rounded where sandals and hooves have rubbed every corner into patience. You move the way this hour prefers, without hurry, without intention, beyond walking past mud brick walls combed by last season's rain and re-smoothed by careful hands. The air tastes faintly of clay. A palm frond taps a parapet in a small, even rhythm. Somewhere, a wooden door clears its throat, decides against a complaint, and settles. You count your steps because counting is restful. 4 steps, breathe out. 4 more, breathe in. The city is still content to pretend it is sleeping. You let it. You round a bend that behaves like a folded page, and 2 goats lift their heads from a fallen leaf as if they are debating its footnotes. Their bells make the sound of coins touching water. Ahead, a courtyard door waits without a nameplate, just a smooth lintel and the faint shine where many hands have pressed. The smell changes as you near it. Less animal, more paper, a sweet trace of cooled smoke and something like almond. It is the smell of ink that learned to live in a dry place. Timbuktu has done this for centuries, gathered words where the desert would prefer emptiness, stacked knowledge in rooms that look almost too humble to hold it. That much is simple and steady. By the 15th and 16th centuries, this city had become a center of learning, drawing scholars to teach law, astronomy, poetry, grammar, and the mathematics of inheritance at places whose names travel easily: Sankore, Sidi Yahia, Jingareber. You carry that fact the way you carry a full water gourd. Useful, dependable, unshowy. You lift the latch with 2 fingers and mind the wood. The courtyard's coolness is immediate. A shallow bowl of shadow with a square of pale sky set neatly on top. On one side stands a low shelf built from palm trunks. Bundles rest there beneath leather wraps, humble parcels that pretend to be nothing at all. On the other side lies a tight-woven mat, its edge as straight as careful handwriting. Someone has swept recently. The floor shows faint crescent strokes, like a river rehearsing its bends. You take off your sandals and let your feet whisper over the mat's smooth reeds. Sitting makes listening easier. The courtyard murmurs to itself. A dove repeats a gentle complaint. A pot gives up the night's cold with a small, hollow click. You take inventory the way an archivist does what is here, what can be handled, what can be left to rest. You notice the grain of the mat under your palm, the tiny amber bead of resin that once leaked from a repair and hardened into a tear, the single strand of goat hair pressed into the corner of the shelf by time and luck. When you loosen the first strap, the leather sighs like someone letting go of a well-meant argument. Inside is a bundle of folded folios wrapped in cloth and tied with narrow cords. The cloth remembers many hands. You can feel the history in the softened edge where it is always pinched. You lift a leaf from the middle. The paper is thicker than you expect, with a fine tooth good for ink that wants to stay. The letters sit dark and confident, slanting forward slightly like travelers eager for evening shade. The script is Arabic, the language of scholarship here, but along the margins, another voice peeks in. Local words whispered in Arabic letters where explanation proves kinder than silence. The page looks like a conversation that never finished and never needed to. You touch only the corner. The ink has long cured, made of soot and gum Arabic, water and patience. Near the top, a protective phrase asks a plain favor of the page: clarity, ease, and readers of sound mind. Beside it, a small doodle curls into being. It might be a fish, or a leaf, or simply a pen testing its temper. The drawing accomplishes nothing except to show that a hand once rested here and felt briefly playful. That is purpose enough. The next folio offers an ordinary marvel, a working calendar of market days and lunar sightings. Along its lower margin, in a hand scarcely larger than an ant's careful walk, someone recorded a recipe for thickening failing ink boil acacia gum until it pearls, scrape the inside of a dried gourd, and mix until the ink stands up on the reed. It is a domestic secret pinned to a learned page, like a kitchen hook added beside a scholarly lamp. This is the sort of small, homely detail that lingers. Knowledge tended not only by teachers, but by the same hands that sweep, mend, and pour. You sit longer because sitting suits the room. The square of sky brightens by a shade you would call milk, if milk kept dust. Outside, water lifts in buckets. Dough takes a last sleepy knead. Greetings fold themselves along the alleys and drift open again. You consider, without ambition, the idea of counting. How many manuscripts sleep behind quiet doors like this? The number changes depending on the mouth that says it. Tens of thousands? Hundreds of thousands across families and mosques and private rooms? Historians still argue whether the total for Timbuktu and its surrounding towns ever climbed into the high hundreds of thousands, or whether such figures are the warm exaggerations of pride and rumor. The argument is gentle in this light. Numbers behave better when no one is rushing them. A fly regards you, rethinks its future, and leaves. You return the folio, rewrap the bundle, and tie the strap. The leather remembers the knot and settles into it with relief. You smooth the cover with a slow palm that librarians use everywhere. It is not magic, it is habit. Habit is a very quiet kind of protection. You do not rise yet. You practice the art of being the right weight in a place a guest that does not lean. Light spills down at a thoughtful angle, cautious of the pages. This is how books live long in a desert city. Doors kept low, windows set deep, shelves close to the ground where the air stays cooler and the wind meddles less. The buildings in the archive share the same temperament, sturdy, measured, pleased to continue. It is easy to imagine the day ahead, measured in small, careful tasks. A teacher will sit on a mat and solve a question with a student who learned patience from his mother's bread. A boy will carry water and then linger too long beside a page that refuses to hurry. Someone will weigh words on a scale they would trust with grain or gold. Someone else will cross out his name so the text can stand alone. Knowledge will travel farther than salt and longer than caravans. And still, at evening, it will come home to be wrapped and tied. A light breeze visits the courtyard and withdraws, mindful of its manners. You stand slowly so you do not interrupt the long conversation between shade and paper. The next bundle waits on the second shelf with the politeness of a raised hand. Another strap, another calm breath, another small sigh from the leather. Outside the door, the dust continues to lie still. You seem to be in agreement. Nothing here is urgent. Even discovery tries not to make a noise. You step back into the lane, where the air has shifted. It is still early, but already the scent has changed. Less cool, more animal, with a thread of warmth creeping along the edges. Somewhere close, sheep move behind a wall, their wool carrying the smell of dry grass and last night's pen. The sound they make is not exactly bleating. It is lower, slower, a conversational rumble as they wait to be led to pasture. The alley narrows until your shoulders almost brush its walls. Mud brick here is the color of weak tea, smooth where fingers have passed, coarse where time has taken its share. Along one stretch, a low niche holds a jar capped with a flat stone. The jar smells faintly of cumin and something sharper. Above it, tied to a jutting peg, a small bundle of paper flutters notes from a scholar to a neighbor, perhaps, or a list for the next market day. The handwriting is cramped, careful, and slightly tilted, as though the words were leaning in to listen. You pause where two lanes meet. The joining space is no larger than a woven mat, but it breathes differently, wider, lighter. The sunlight here lands without asking, pooling on the ground in soft gold. In the corner, half hidden behind a curtain of frayed rope, a wooden bench leans under a pile of folded goat hides. The hides are stiff but not brittle. You can imagine them softening in the hands of a binder, cut and shaped to cradle pages. It is easy to forget that a book's first shape is often something that once walked. This part of the city carries its own particular music. A donkey's hoof scuffs the ground. A child calls out to someone unseen, the syllables drawn long and unhurried. Two men pass by in quiet debate, their voices low, the rhythm more important than the words. Their robes brush the dust into lazy curls behind them. You follow at a distance, not because you have anywhere particular to go, but because their pace seems exactly right for this hour. They lead you toward the side of Jingarubber Mosque, where the shade runs deep and solid along the wall. The air here is different again, cool, almost damp, in the way thick shadow can trick the skin. Your own breath seems quieter. The mosque's walls rise in gentle tiers studded with wooden beams that jut out like the rungs of a ladder too large for any person. Between the beams, the wall shows its history in layers of earth and straw, repaired again and again by hands that know its texture better than they know their own. You stand still, letting your eyes travel along the wall's surface. Tiny cracks branch outward like veins, each one a map of sun and wind. In the mortar, you see grains of shell that once belonged to a riverbed or a sea long gone. Somewhere overhead, a dove drops a note into the day, answered by another in a place you cannot see. The sound passes easily into the coolness, settling as if it has been here for centuries. Timbuktu's mosque walls have sheltered more than prayer. They have leaned over scholars at work, guarded gatherings of students, and stood beside the entrances to private libraries kept by families for generations. In the 16th century, when the city's reputation as a center of learning reached as far as Cairo and Fez, it was said that entire caravans carried nothing but books to and from its gates. The image lingers, strings of camels swaying under loads of wrapped manuscripts, their shadows stitched into the sand. You glance toward a smaller door set into the wall's side. Its arch is low enough that you would need to bow to enter. The wood is carved in shallow patterns of lines and curves, worn in places until the design dissolves into smoothness. At its base, a thin line of sand is gathered like a bookmark placed by the wind. The smell here is layered, the faint mineral scent of clay, the sharper edge of sheep nearby, and the soft, dry sweetness of paper hidden behind walls. You imagine a room within, its air heavy with the breath of stored words. Perhaps a table stands there with a reed pen resting across an inkwell. The ink is dark as fresh river mud. Your hand brushes the wall, and a grain of dust stays behind on your skin. It feels both fragile and persistent, a reminder that the same desert trying to erase the city also built it. Scholars who worked here knew that balance well. They kept manuscripts wrapped, shelves low to the ground, and windows narrow to guard against heat and wind. A man passes, carrying a tray covered in a cloth. Steam escapes in the thin thread where the cloth lifts with his stride. The smell of boiling mint follows him, light and sharp. You think of the tea that waits in shaded courtyards, poured high into small glasses until the froth thickens on top. The tea is as much a part of study as ink and paper, its sweetness waking the tongue when the mind grows slow. From somewhere behind the mosque, a soft braying begins, drawn out, thoughtful, as if the donkey has a point to make but will not rush to make it. You smile without meaning to. The sound folds easily into the hour's other notes. Nothing here hurries. Even the dust waits for the wind to decide. Scholars still argue whether the oldest private libraries in Timbuktu were born from mosque schools themselves or from families collecting texts independently before the great teaching centers flourished. The truth might be a mix of both, but the question has never needed an urgent answer. In a city that measures time by the slow wear of stone and leather, a debate can take as long as it pleases. You lean a little farther into the shade, the cool air holding you in place. The mosque wall seems to accept your company. Somewhere beyond it lies another door without a nameplate, another room with low shelves and a mat on the floor, another quiet in which the rustle of paper sounds louder than footsteps. The street between you and that door is short, but you decide to stay where you are for a few breaths longer. Here, the sun cannot touch you yet. Here, the smell of sheep and paper has already learned to belong together. You shift your weight and begin to move again. The mosque's cool wall at your back, the narrow street stretching ahead in a curve you cannot quite see past. The light is still soft but has begun to thicken, dust motes brightening where they turn in the air. The sound of your steps changes as you pass from packed earth to a patch of worn stone, smooth, pale, and slightly warmer, as though the sun left a memory there from yesterday. The street tilts gently toward the heart of the city, where traders will later spread their mats with piles of salt, slabs of dried fish, and rolls of fabric from far ports. But for now, the center is quiet, claimed by shadows. At the corner, you pause beside a low bench where a jug sits in the slant of light, its surface beaded with morning damp. The clay has been smoothed by use until it almost shines. A faint dark line at its mouth shows where the water meets the lip. You tip it slightly and drink. The water is cool and carries the faint mineral taste of a deep well, as if it remembers the stone walls that have kept it in the dark. You follow the curve to where it meets another lane, This one broader. Its packed earth marked by the narrow ruts of cartwheels. Across the way, the side of Jingureber Mosque rises again. But now you see a different face, one broken by a tall, arched entryway. Beyond the entry, a shaded passage leads deeper into the building. The air drifting from it feels cooler still, touched by the scent of old wood and lime wash. You linger at the threshold without stepping inside, letting your eyes adjust to the dim interior. There, along the wall, a small alcove holds a stack of wooden tablets. Each is about the length of your forearm, with smooth surfaces stained a deep honey brown from years of handling. A scholar once explained that these boards are for writing practice, the ink washed off and replaced until the hand learns each letter's curve. Even in a city known for bound manuscripts, the tablets remain an older way of learning, quieter and more forgiving than pen and paper. The alley beside the mosque narrows again, its walls leaning just enough to make the passage feel private. Here, the shade is deeper, and the smell shifts to something richer, the faint bitterness of dried ink, the dusty sweetness of palm fiber. At the far end, the alley opens into a small square courtyard bordered by low walls. In the center, a single acacia tree spreads its shade, its branches spare but deliberate, like the strokes of a careful hand. Beneath it sits a man with a reed pen, bent over a page. His robe gathers around him in loose folds, the fabric pooling at his sides. You cannot see the words he writes, but his movements are slow and exact, as if each line is a measured breath. You sit on the edge of the courtyard, close enough to feel the air shift when a breeze stirs the tree's leaves. They are narrow, almost feathery, and their shadows flicker on the walls. A clay jar rests near the man's knee. From it comes the smell of ink, stronger now, a mix of soot, gum, Arabic, and something faintly resinous. The scent is grounding, like bread rising in a warm room or rain just before it falls. From here, you can hear the distant hum of voices, students reciting lines in a cadence that rises and falls like slow waves. They are somewhere beyond the wall, hidden but present, their sound threading through the stillness. You close your eyes to listen. The rhythm repeats, each verse followed by a pause long enough for the air to settle before the next begins. The pauses feel as important as the words. Timbuktu scholars have always known the value of such rhythm, a fact as steady as the mosque itself. In the height of the city's scholarly life, lessons were often given outdoors in the shade of trees, with students sitting in a semicircle around the teacher. It was a shape that encouraged both attention and patience, neither rushing the mind nor letting it wander too far. Your eyes wander to the base of the acacia. Its roots push gently against the packed soil, making small ridges where grains of sand have gathered. A tuft of grass leans there, stubborn and pale, holding on where the tree's shade keeps the ground just damp enough after rare rain. You think of how the same roots have been here longer than most of the books in the city, listening to all the conversations that passed under its branches. The man writing does not look up, but his pen lifts for a moment before returning to the page. You wonder if he is copying a known text or shaping something new. Scholars still argue whether many manuscripts in Timbuktu were unique works of local authors or careful copies of distant texts brought by traders. In truth, the line between the two blurs easily. A copied text often carried new marginal notes, commentary, or even small stories added by the scribe. A work that began in Cairo or Andalusia might arrive here transformed, same words at its core, but now wearing the local air. The breeze fades, and the courtyard settles into stillness again. The tree's shadow moves almost imperceptibly across the ground. A fly lands on the rim of the ink jar and sits for a moment before lifting off again, leaving no trace except a faint ripple on the ink surface. You stay longer than you meant to. The sun has not yet reached the center of the courtyard, and you are content to wait until it does. There is no rush. The streets beyond can keep their slow unfolding without you. You rest your hands on the warm clay of the low wall and let the warmth seep into your palms. Somewhere, a sheep calls out, long and low, the sound carrying over rooftops until it becomes part of the air itself. When you finally rise, the man writing has turned to a fresh page. You leave him to his work, stepping back into the narrow alley where the shade is still deep. The air here smells again of dust and brick, but now it carries with it the memory of ink and leaves a quiet mixture that follows you as you walk on. You turn another corner, and the light spills ahead in a flat sheet. The street opens slightly, not enough to be called a square, but wide enough for the air to feel looser, the sound less held between walls. A pair of donkeys stand here, one idly swishing its tail, the other with its head bent low to a shallow trough. Their shadows are soft-edged in the morning light, folding neatly beneath them like worn blankets. Across from them, set into the wall, is a door so plain you would pass it without thought, if not for the way the ground before it is worn to a shallow dip. The wood is the color of dried dates, its grain deep and unvarnished. No sign marks it, only a faint pattern carved into the lintel, geometric lines that turn inward until they meet at a quiet center. You push gently, and the door moves with the slow weight of age. Inside is a passage, dim and cool. The floor under your feet is not stone but hard-packed earth, smooth as clay that has been walked for centuries. The air carries a thin ribbon of scent-old leather, paper, and something faintly sweet, like crushed flowers long dried. At the end of the passage, the light changes again, spilling from a room that opens onto a small inner courtyard. Here, shelves run low along the walls, no taller than your hip, their surfaces crowded with bundles wrapped in leather and tied with twisted fiber cords. The light falls in narrow beams from two high, latticed windows, each crossbar catching dust in tiny golden drifts. In the far corner, a woven mat waits, its edges curled just enough to show where someone has sat many times. You lower yourself onto the mat and let your eyes rest on the nearest shelf. The leather wraps vary, some smooth and evenly colored, others mottled and worn, with the grain lifting at the edges. A single strip of palm leaf serves as a label on one bundle, its surface marked with thin, dark lines that name the work within. You lift the bundle gently, feeling the give of the leather and the weight of the paper beneath. The ties come loose with a patient tug. Inside are folios, each leaf carefully stacked, their edges feathered slightly from handling. The script is dark and deliberate, every letter shaped as though it knew it would be read centuries later. In the margins, notes run in a smaller hand, angled neatly, explaining or questioning the main text. The page in your hand speaks of astronomy, measurements of stars, notations of seasonal skies, and a simple diagram showing the sweep of the moon across a month. Timbuktu's libraries often held such works alongside poetry, law, medicine, and trade records. A fact as steady as the shelves themselves. By the 16th century, it was common for a single family to own hundreds of volumes, passing them from generation to generation like land or tools. You imagine those hands wrapping and unwrapping, reading and retying until the leather grew soft at the corners. A loose sheet slips from between the folios and rests on your lap. Its ink is lighter, its hand more hurried. Across the top, someone has drawn a jagged line, not quite straight, with dots scattered below, perhaps a sketch of a coastline or a set of trade stops. Along one side runs a line of text in a different ink, noting something about the wind and the month of the mango. The page feels less like a finished work and more like a pocket's worth of thought, an idea, paused mid-breath. From the courtyard, the faint sound of sweeping reaches you, a rhythmic, even motion, the bristles brushing over stone or packed earth. The sound is soft but steady, as if the act itself is more important than the result. You glance toward the light and see a woman in a pale headscarf moving slowly across the courtyard's far side. Her broom is made of bound reeds, and each pass sends a small shiver through the dust at her feet. On a low stool near the door rests a shallow bowl with a few curled strips of dried plant. The smell drifts faintly, slightly bitter, slightly sharp, perhaps a pest deterrent or something to scent the air. The combination of leather, paper, and that faint plant aroma settles into something that feels like belonging. You think about the bundles you have yet to open. There are dozens here, each with its own weight, its own voice waiting in quiet. But you choose to linger with this one, turning another page to find a table of numbers written with meticulous care. A thin red line runs beneath every 10th entry. The ink still holds a muted warmth, the color of clay after rain. Historians still argue whether these private rooms unmarked, tucked into family homes once rivaled, or even surpass the collections kept in the larger mosque libraries. Some believe the most precious manuscripts were always kept in private hands, protected from the reach of rulers and outsiders. Others argue the opposite, that these smaller rooms were branches of the great scholarly centers, part of a web that kept learning alive. The truth may be a weave of both, a pattern hidden in the folds. A fly circles lazily near the high window, the hum of its wings briefly louder than the sound of sweeping. When it settles, the room returns to its softer hum, distant voices, the scrape of a stool's leg, the faint shuffle of a page turned somewhere beyond the wall. You rewrap the folios, fitting the leather snug around them, and replace the bundle exactly where it sat. The shelf seems to take the weight back with ease, as though it has been waiting for the familiar shape. You run your fingers along the edge, feeling the cool smoothness of the wood, worn by years of such motions. For a while, you do nothing at all. You watch the light shift across the floor, the narrow beams angling slightly as the sun adjusts its reach. In a place like this, movement is slow and deliberate, and even the light seems to follow the rule. The leather bundle you've just returned sits in its place with the quiet satisfaction of a well-finished task. You stand slowly, joints adjusting to the change in position, and glance around the small library room again. The walls are thick, holding back the heat for now, but you can already feel the day beginning to press faintly at their edges. The air has a stillness that feels deliberate, as though even dust motes have learned not to hurry here. Along the opposite wall, another low shelf leans slightly forward under the weight of its contents. A few of the bundles are smaller, thin, neat rolls, tied with narrow strips of hide. One of them has a strip of red cloth peeking from beneath the leather, like a tongue caught mid-sentence. You reach for it, and the bundle yields easily to your hand, lighter than you expect. The leather is soft and carries the faint tang of oil, the kind used to keep it from cracking in the dry air. Untying it releases a small sigh of dust, so fine it disappears almost as soon as it rises. Inside is a single manuscript, its pages stitched together at one edge with thread that has darkened to the color of weathered rope. The paper itself is pale cream, its surface smooth but slightly wavy, as though it once curled in humidity before drying again. The text begins in a bold hand, the first line marked with an ornamental flourish. It is a treatise on medicinal plants, opening with praise for the healing power of the date palm and moving into descriptions of leaves, roots, and resins. Between the lines, smaller notes fill the gaps, dosages, alternate names, occasional warnings written in a different hand. Near the edge of one page, there is a tiny drawing of a leaf, rendered with surprising care, veins traced lightly, the stem shaded with the tip of the pen. Timbuktu scholars were often physicians as well as jurists or poets. This fact is steady enough. Manuscripts from the city cover everything from surgical techniques to herbal remedies, sometimes blending learned Arabic medical texts with local knowledge. The combination is seamless, as though the desert itself approved the merging of worlds. You turn another page and find a recipe for a cooling drink made from tamarind and a pinch of ground seeds, noted for days when the breath is hot. The handwriting here is smaller, as if trying to fit the thought into an already full space. At the bottom, in faint ink, someone has added what appears to be a proverb. The bitter root teaches the tongue. You roll the words on your own tongue in silence. From outside comes the muffled sound of a boy's laughter, followed by the clink of a cup being set down. The sound drifts into the room, finds no resistance, and fades. You imagine tea cooling in small glasses, the steam carrying mint into the air. In the libraries of Timbuktu, work was often punctuated by such pauses: small glasses of tea, bowls of dates, a moment's shade. Knowledge here did not always require long hours at a desk. Sometimes it simply asked for presence and a willingness to turn the page slowly. You set the manuscript aside for a moment and notice the small objects on the shelf beside where it rested. A wooden inkwell, square and simple, its lid slightly ajar. A reed pen sharpened to a fine point. A round, flat stone, with one side polished from grinding pigment. Each bears the marks of long-use nicks, scratches, faint stains that no washing could remove. They are as much a part of the library as the shelves themselves. In the corner near the door, a narrow wooden ladder leans against the wall. It is not tall just enough to reach the higher beams, where spare bundles are stored above head height. The rungs are smooth, slightly bowed in the middle from years of climbing. You imagine a scholar's hand gripping them, balancing a manuscript in the other arm, the soft creak of wood under careful weight. Historians still argue whether these smaller libraries were organized by subject or simply by convenience, placing what fit where there was space. The truth may be that order shifted over time, bending to the habits of whoever kept the keys. What is certain is that the knowledge survived regardless of the system, even when titles faded and bundles lost their labels. You return to the medicinal manuscript and trace the margin where the leaf drawing sits. The ink has not faded much, perhaps protected by the page's position in the middle of the bundle. You imagine the scribe pausing to sketch it, perhaps plucking the leaf itself from a pouch for reference. The act feels both practical and intimate, a bridge between observation and preservation. A faint breeze stirs the air near the high windows, carrying with it the smell of warm earth. Somewhere in the courtyard, a broom's bristles whisper across stone again. You hear the soft thud of a door closing and the shuffle of sandals. The day is beginning to stretch its arms. You wrap the manuscript once more, tucking the red cloth neatly inside the leather. The tie slips into its familiar knot with ease. Replacing it on the shelf, you notice how the bundles lean slightly against one another, each holding the next in place, like companions in a long conversation. The shelf seems content to bear their weight a while longer. You step back toward the doorway, letting the cooler air of the library cling to you a moment before stepping out into the brightness. In the passage, the light from the courtyard falls across the floor in a perfect rectangle. You stand in its edge, half in shade, half in sun, and let the warmth creep into your shoulders. Ahead lies another street, another door without a name, and perhaps another shelf waiting to be opened. But for now, you breathe in the mingled scents of leather, paper, and earth, letting them settle into memory before moving on. The doorway releases you back into the brightness, where the light is thickened into something almost tangible. The air feels warmer now, pressing lightly against your skin, though the breeze still drifts lazily along the lane. You follow it, letting it lead you past walls where the mud plaster shows both care and weather-smooth patches from recent repair beside older sections that have taken on the faint corrugation of age. Ahead, the street bends toward a smaller mosque wall, its surface broken by a narrow slit window covered in a lattice of carved wood. You pause, tilting your head to peer through. Inside, the air is darker and cooler. The shapes are softened by shadow, but you can make out the edge of a low shelf lined with tightly wrapped bundles. There's a scent that reaches even here, dry paper mingled with the faint trace of burnt resin, the kind used to keep away insects. You step back and continue along the curve, passing a wooden bench where an elderly man sits with a reed pen in his hand. He's not writing, only turning the pen slowly between his fingers, as though the movement itself keeps a thought warm. His robe is pale sand in color, the edges frayed but clean. Beside him rests a shallow dish of water with a single sprig of mint floating in it. You nod, and he nods back, both of you choosing not to disturb the air with words. The lane narrows again until it opens into a shaded courtyard. A palm trunk rises from one corner, its bark worn into shallow grooves by climbing hands. At its base, a low table holds a neat stack of folded cloth. The colors are soft and sun-faded muted indigo, clay red, and a pale cream that might once have been white. One of the cloths is already spread on the table, and on it rests a row of open manuscripts. You approach slowly, so as not to stir the edges of the pages. The ink here is dark, almost glossy, in places where it has caught the light. One volume lies open to a page filled with geometric designs, circles within circles, lines radiating outward like spokes. The precision is exact, the hand steady, as though the scribe measured each curve with the same care given to weighing gold. A small note in the margin identifies the diagram as a calculation of eclipses. Timbuktu's libraries were not just depositories of text, but of image and measure. A certain fact endures. Scholars here recorded astronomical observations in remarkable detail, often combining them with tables for navigation or agricultural planning. This work in front of you could just as easily belong to a navigator plotting a sea voyage as to a farmer deciding when to plant. Near the corner of the page, You notice a small, almost invisible smudge where the scribe's wrist must have rested. It's a human mark, unplanned, inevitable, and strangely comforting. On another page, a faint brown stain blooms in the margin, likely from tea spilled decades ago. The text ignores it, continuing without apology. A breeze stirs the cloth under the manuscripts, lifting one corner just enough to reveal the surface beneath. The table is made of cedar, its wood pale and clean, with the faintest scent rising where the grain is exposed. You place your hand on it and feel the warmth that has gathered from the morning air. Beside the table, a wicker basket holds a collection of tools: reed pens in varying lengths, small knives for trimming the tips, a flat stone with traces of pigment, and a lidded jar that likely holds ground charcoal for ink. You imagine the quiet rhythm of work here, a scribe leaning forward, dipping the pen, tracing each line, pausing to sharpen the point before continuing. From the shaded edge of the courtyard, a boy appears carrying a shallow tray with 2 small glasses of tea. The liquid glows amber in the light, with a faint foam trembling on top. He sets the tray near the table, and the scent of mint and sugar rolls gently into the air. Without a word, he vanishes again into the brightness outside. You take one glass, feeling the thin metal rim warm against your fingers, and sip. The tea is thickly sweet, each swallow leaving a faint grain of sugar on your tongue. A low, rhythmic sound begins in the distance, a drum played slowly, each beat spaced far enough apart to let the air recover. It's not a call or a signal, just a sound folded into the day. The manuscripts, the table, the cloth, and the tea all seem to accept it without reaction, as though it has always been part of their company. Historians still argue whether many of these diagrams and astronomical tables were original to Timbuktu or copied from works that had traveled from the Middle East or North Africa. The copying was never exact. Local scribes often added adjustments based on observation or reworked layouts to suit their own teaching methods. The page in front of you might hold numbers that began their journey in Cairo, but wear the handwriting of someone who had never left this city. The drum fades, replaced by the quieter pulse of the courtyard paper rustling faintly when the breeze returns, the soft creak of wicker as the basket settles under its load. You finish your tea, leaving a faint ring of moisture on the tray, and set the glass back gently. You do not open another manuscript. Instead, you stand and let your gaze travel over the table, memorizing the curve of each page and the way the light lies across them. The cloth beneath them shifts slightly, catching the sun in its threads. You feel as though you are walking away from a conversation that will continue without you. At the courtyard's edge, the palm trunk leans slightly toward the door, its fronds shivering faintly overhead. You step into the lane again, the light brighter now, the walls warm enough that you can feel their heat even without touching them. Somewhere ahead lies another quiet door, another shelf of waiting pages. But for now, the scent of mint, tea, and cedar stays with you as you walk on. You follow the lane until it narrows so much you have to turn sideways to pass. The walls on either side are close enough that your sleeve brushes one, leaving a faint mark in the fine dust clinging there. The air here is cooler, the sunlight reduced to a pale strip running along the ground between your feet. Somewhere ahead, a faint tapping sound repeats in slow rhythm, wood against wood, steady and patient. When you reach the end of the passage, it opens suddenly into a small, square room with no roof except the sky. The walls are high and plain, their tops lined with short wooden beams jutting outward like blunt fingers. Against one wall, a man sits cross-legged, a shallow basket in his lap. He is mending the leather cover of a manuscript, the tapping sound coming from the small wooden mallet in his hand. Each strike is measured, gentle, as though he is persuading rather than forcing the material into place. The manuscript cover is a deep, uneven brown, the surface bearing tiny scars from years of handling. The man works with thin strips of softened hide, threading them through holes along the edge to reinforce the seam. A narrow awl lies beside him, its handle worn smooth from use. As you watch, he adjusts the leather so the spine sits straighter, then runs his thumb along it in a slow stroke that seems more like reassurance than inspection. On the ground near him lies a small pile of fragments, pieces of leather too brittle to reuse, curled and cracked at the edges. They look like the molted skins of something long gone, carrying the ghost of their former shape. You kneel to examine one, and it crumbles slightly between your fingers, releasing a faint, dry scent of dust and animal oil. Timbuktu's libraries have always needed such care. A certain fact remains. Leather bindings, while sturdy, suffer in dry climates if not regularly oiled and repaired. Families who kept manuscripts often trained one or two members in basic conservation skills, enough to patch, reinforce, and keep the bindings from failing entirely. You think of how many hours must have been spent in rooms like this, working slowly through the quiet heat of the afternoon. On a low bench against the opposite wall sits another manuscript awaiting repair. Its cover has split along one side, exposing the stack of pages within. The edges of those pages are feathered, some slightly curled, as if they had absorbed moisture once, long ago, before being dried again. A small piece of folded cloth rests on top, perhaps to keep the dust off while it waits its turn. The man looks up briefly, his eyes calm, and nods toward the fragments at your feet. "Too far gone," his voice says, without sound, just a glance, a small motion of his mouth. He returns to his work, pulling the strip of hide tight and smoothing it with the flat of his hand. The rhythm resumes. Tap, adjust, smooth, tap. You notice a clay jar set into the wall shadow. Its mouth is covered with a piece of palm leaf tied with string. When you lift it slightly, the scent rises rich and slightly sharp. Oiled leather, stored cool to keep it pliable. The smell clings faintly to your fingers after you let the jar rest again. Historians still argue whether many manuscripts were rebound multiple times over their lives or kept in their original covers for centuries. The answer likely varies from book to book, depending on the family, the climate, and the value placed on the work. A text copied onto strong paper might survive with little intervention, while others needed periodic attention to keep from disappearing entirely. Overhead, a cloud drifts across the square of sky, softening the light that falls into the room. The change is immediate, shadows blur, and the air feels heavier, almost still. The man pauses to stretch his hands, fingers flexing wide, then returns to the seam, his concentration unbroken. You watch a while longer, the repetitive movement lulling your thoughts. The mallet's tap is steady, a sound without urgency, as if it could continue indefinitely without tiring. In this room, time belongs to the manuscript, not the clock. When he finishes the last stitch, the man knots the strip neatly, tucks the end into the seam, and smooths the spine one final time. He sets the repaired book aside with a care that makes the act feel ceremonial. The next volume waits patiently on the bench. You stand, brushing a faint trace of dust from your knees, and glance once more at the pile of fragments. They are past saving, yet they are still here, kept perhaps as reminders of what work can and cannot preserve. The man meets your eye again, this time with the faintest smile, as if he knows you understand. Stepping back into the passage, you feel the warmth of the sun return to your shoulders. The lane ahead curves slightly, leading you deeper into the city's quiet folds. Somewhere beyond this turn will be another door, another small room with its own quiet tasks, and you will walk toward it as slowly as the day will allow. The lane beyond the bookbinder's courtyard is narrow and uneven, its surface broken by shallow dips where rain once pooled before sinking into the earth. A breeze pushes from behind, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and something sweet, perhaps dates warming in the sun. You follow the curve of the path until it opens into a long, low street lined with walls the color of pale sand. On your left, a doorway stands ajar. The door itself is heavy wood, reinforced with narrow iron strips, the metal dulled to a gray that no polishing cloth has touched in years. You step inside and find yourself in a room that smells of ink before anything else. It's a dry, mineral scent, deepened by the faint tang of soot and the faint sweetness of gum arabic. In the center of the room sits a low table. On it rests a single unrolled manuscript, the parchment pale against the dark wood. The letters are black and glossy, the ink so dense it almost swallows the light. You lean closer and see that the lines are evenly spaced, each word held in balance between the next and the one before it. The hand is confident but not hurried. Beside the manuscript, an inkwell carved from smooth bone sits in a shallow dish. The dish catches stray drops, its surface stained with overlapping rings of dried black. A thin reed pen rests across the top, its tip finely trimmed, the fibers split just enough to hold the ink. You touch the dish lightly and feel the rough texture of years' worth of dried pigment. Along one wall, a series of shallow shelves hold tightly rolled scrolls. They are bound not with leather but with thin strips of palm leaf, tied in knots that can be undone with a single pull. The ends of the scrolls show their age. Some edges are crisp and sharp, others softened into a faint wave. A few have small tags attached, each one a narrow slip of parchment with a short description in faded ink. Timbuktu's manuscripts were not all bound in the codex form, a steady fact. Some were kept as scrolls, particularly older works or those copied from traditions where the scroll was still preferred. The choice of form sometimes depended on the scribe's training, or on the practical matter of how the paper or parchment had been obtained. You pick up one scroll at random and loosen its tie. The parchment unwinds with a slow sigh, its surface catching the light in soft ripples. The text within is smaller than you expected, each letter formed with precision so that no space is wasted. About halfway down the scroll, you notice a change, an insertion of several lines in a darker ink, perhaps added years later. The handwriting is slightly different, the letters more compact, but the addition feels seamless, as though the scroll always meant to include it. From the far side of the room comes the sound of movement. You glance over and see an elderly man seated on a mat, bent over a sheet of paper. His robe is gathered neatly around him, and his hands move with deliberate care. He is not writing new words, but tracing over old ones with fresh ink, strengthening letters that have begun to fade. The smell of the ink he uses is sharper, fresher, its edges still alive. Beside him lies a narrow strip of leather with several reed pens resting in a row. Each has been trimmed to a different width, ready for fine work or broader strokes as needed. He selects one, dips it carefully, and resumes tracing, the ink flowing smoothly into the grooves left by the original scribe's hand. Historians still argue whether this practice retracing faded text was always considered acceptable, or whether purists preferred to leave manuscripts untouched even if they grew difficult to read. In places like Timbuktu, where preservation often meant active care, retracing may have been less about altering the work and more about keeping its voice audible. The man does not speak, but his presence fills the room in the same way the smell of ink does, subtle, steady, and without hurry. You stand quietly, listening to the faint scratch of the reed tip against the page. It's a soft sound, almost like cloth being smoothed, and it repeats in an unbroken rhythm. On a shelf near the door rests a small clay pot with a lid of woven palm fiber. When you lift it, you find it holds powdered pigment, dark as night. You imagine it mixed with water and gum arabic, transformed into ink that will outlast the hand that writes with it. The pot's weight feels solid in your palm, like something that has been waiting patiently for centuries to be used. You return the scroll to its shelf, retie the palm leaf strip, and smooth it down with your fingers. The knot falls into place easily, as though it remembers being tied. For a moment, you stand in the center of the room, letting your eyes rest on the shelves, the table, and the quiet figure on the mat. The air is thick with the memory of words, each one still holding the shape of the voice that first spoke it. When you step back outside, the brightness is almost startling. The lane seems narrower after the stillness of the room. A gust of wind stirs the dust at your feet, carrying with it the faintest trace of ink and bone. Ahead, the street bends again, promising another door, another voice waiting in silence. The lane runs straight for a short stretch before narrowing again, its walls leaning toward each other as though sharing a secret you are not yet meant to hear. The ground is packed earth, firm underfoot but dimpled with the shallow imprints of sandals that passed earlier in the morning. Above, a line of laundry robes in muted blues and ochres swings gently between two windows, their edges fluttering just enough to shift the shade below. You come to a doorway so small you have to bow your head to enter. The threshold is worn smooth, the wood darkened where countless hands have steadied themselves on the way in. Inside, the light falls softly, filtered through a reed lattice in the wall. It lands in narrow strips across a low shelf that runs the length of the room. On that shelf rest several stacks of manuscripts, some bound in leather, others in cloth wraps. One, however, sits uncovered. You kneel to look more closely. The manuscript is open, its pages slightly warped but still strong. The ink is a deep brown, lighter than the black you've seen in other rooms, and the script is slightly more angular, the letters holding their strokes with an almost architectural precision. Along the outer margin, there are scribbles, small notes in a different hand and a different language. The letters are sharp and unfamiliar, their shapes distinct from the flowing Arabic script of the main text. It is not unusual here. A steady fact. Manuscripts in Timbuktu sometimes carry marginalia in languages, no longer read locally remnants of trade routes, traveling scholars, or earlier owners. The languages could be Songhai, Tamashek, or something brought from far away, like Hebrew or Greek. You trace a line of these smaller letters with your eyes, wondering if they explain, challenge, or simply echo the main text. Near the top of the page is a tiny drawing, no larger than your thumbnail, of what appears to be a boat. It is only a few lines, a curved hull, a single mast, and a suggestion of sails. Perhaps it is a doodle from an idle scribe, or a marker to remember a story within the text. The ink has bled slightly into the paper, softening the lines until the boat seems almost to be rocking on a ripple of parchment. The smell here is more layered than in the other rooms you visited. There is the expected scent of paper and leather, but also something sharper, maybe the lingering trace of an herbal mixture once used to deter insects. It has a faint bite, like crushed leaves rubbed between fingers. In the far corner, a small clay burner sits cold, its last ashes still faintly aromatic. On a low stool beside the shelf rests a cup half full of tea, its surface now flat and dark from sitting too long. A ring of dried sugar clings to the rim, catching the light. Beside it, a narrow strip of paper has been folded in half and used as a makeshift bookmark. You lift it gently and see it bears a single line of text in neat handwriting. Perhaps a verse, perhaps just a reminder to return. Historians still argue whether the foreign marginalia in these manuscripts were always written at the time of copying or added later by other readers. The question carries its own quiet fascination. Is the margin a conversation across centuries, or simply the voice of a single moment? A faint sound draws your attention, footsteps in the lane outside, soft but quick, then fading again. This room holds the sound differently than the others. It's close, more contained, the shelves acting like walls within walls. You can almost feel the air listening. You slide the uncovered manuscript gently back toward the middle of the shelf, placing a cloth loosely over it to keep the dust from settling too deeply. Then you turn to examine the wrapped bundles stacked nearby. One is tied with a cord that has been repaired mid-length, the join marked by a knot of different fiber. You imagine the moment someone decided not to replace the cord entirely, just mend what was frayed, keep what could still hold. In the narrow beam of light from the reed window, dust floats in slow spirals. You stand and watch it for a while, the motes rising and falling without pattern, each one drifting until it disappears into shadow. The silence here is not empty. It has texture, shaped by the faint rustle of paper settling on itself and the almost imperceptible creak of wood adjusting to the day's warmth. When you leave, you bow your head again to pass through the low doorway. The sun outside feels sharper now, though the lane is still mostly in shade. The smell of herbs lingers faintly on your hands, even though you never touch the burner. Ahead, the street bends toward what looks like a larger courtyard, its walls taller, its entrance wide enough for a cart to pass. Somewhere inside, you can already imagine the slow turning of pages. You follow the curve of the lane until it eases into a patch of sun, and there a boy appears as if the light itself has sent him bare feet, quick eyes. A tray balanced on one palm. Two small glasses sit on the tray, a copper pot beside them. Steam writes a thin line upward and then erases itself. When he sets the tray on a low threshold stone, the glasses tremble faintly and the tea shows a green-brown glow, the color of dates held up to the sun. Sugar nests in the bottom, like pale gravel. He lifts the pot high and pours. The stream is narrow, steady, confident. When the glass is half full, he tips it back into the pot, then pours again and again, a practice as much about air as about liquid. With each pass, the tea grows brighter in the glass, froth gathering like a small cloud at the rim. When at last he leaves the tea to rest, A delicate crust begins to dry around the lip, each crystal finding its place as neatly as words on a line. You hold the warm glass and feel the faint grit of sugar where your thumb meets the rim. The sweetness will arrive first, then the mint, then the small, grounding bitterness that keeps the drink from being a story told only in one note. You sit on the threshold because thresholds know how to host a pause. The street is quiet enough that you can hear the tea settling tiny sounds that are not quite bubbles, not quite silence. The boy leans his shoulder to the wall and regards the sky like someone checking a clock only he can read. A donkey passes without comment. Far off, a drum practices patience again, leaving room between its beats for corners to breathe. Tea belongs to work here in the way shade belongs to walls. A steady fact, shaped by caravans and habit. By the 19th century, green tea and sugar traveled the Sahara in regular caravans from the Maghreb, so that even in cities of mud, brick, and dust, a glass of mint tea could be expected in courtyards and study rooms, sweet enough to wake the mind, bitter enough to hold it steady. In Timbuktu, the glass often comes to the mat the way ink comes to the pen, as equipment, not treat. You taste and understand. The sweetness cleans the mouth where dust has settled. The mint opens a careful window behind the eyes. The heat meets the heat, and they agree to get along. The boy points his chin at your glass, a silent question. You nod, and he smiles without showing teeth, then tilts the copper pot again to fill the second glass. He sets it beside yours with the care of someone placing a small book back where it goes. Foam settles in matching caps. For a while, you both drink and say nothing. The lane gives you the sounds it has: ready cloth, brushing brick, a single goat protesting a complicated idea, the far call of someone looking for someone else. Across the lane, a doorway stands open. Inside, you glimpse a mat, a shelf, a bundle. The sweet smell rides the air into that shadow and returns bearing the faint, papery scent it found there. The pairing is familiar enough that the brain stops separating them. Tea and paper, sugar and leather, mint and dust. The mind can learn any neighborhood if given a little time. On the threshold stone near your knee sits a small saucer with 3 sugar lumps, each a different size, like a family portrait without faces. The boy notices you noticing, picks up the smallest piece, and taps it lightly against the rim of the cup to make a soft crystalline rain. He grins because the sound pleases him. You remember, from another courtyard, the fine ring left on a glass when tea cools and sugar dries, a pale halo that glints if the light catches it just right. It is a decoration the drink makes for itself. Not all drinks here have always been tea, and not all tea here has always been mint. Scholars still argue whether the famous 3 pours bitter as life, strong as love, sweet as death arrived in Timbuktu with the same ceremony they carried along Saharan caravan routes, or whether the city learned its own rhythm for pouring, tasting, and talking. Some say the ritual came whole. Others say it gathered itself slowly around work, as habits do. The uncertainty sits easily beside your glass. Ceremonies, like margins, grow by use. A traveler's quirk drifted here with the leaves, too. Some 19th century visitors, startled by the strength and sweetness, nicknamed this brew desert whiskey, even though it has no such fire, only heat, sugar, and a mint that behaves like a clear thought. You picture a trader teaching his mouth new arithmetic. How many lumps for a morning of copying? How many for a lesson that runs long? The answer, like most answers, depends on the day. A cat appears, which is another way to say the city decides to show you a small, certain thing. It pads up the lane, tail like a question mark with no question left to ask, and settles exactly where the shade is widest. It closes its eyes, but not all the way, as if it wants to keep a bookmark in the scene. The boy flicks a fingernail against his empty glass, and the cat's ear turns toward the sound, then away again. From inside the open doorway comes the rustle of paper, the small thud of a bundle set down. The scent of ink is faint, but present. You imagine a folio open to a page of trade accounts, salt tallies, cloth lengths, names confirming delivery, and beside it a second glass of tea leaving a wet ring that, if no one interrupts it, will dry into a necklace of crystals around the circle's edge. A domestic geology, building itself while you blink. The boy refills the pot from a narrow-necked jar that sweats quietly in the shade. He lifts the lid, and a new thread of mint rises. He adds a pinch of leaves with an expert's indifference and taps the pot against the tray in a gesture too small to notice unless you're watching. You are watching. That is your current occupation, to witness without trying to keep anything. You think, as you sip, of older mornings when tea had not yet claimed the table. Before green tea and sugar were regular travelers, there were local infusions, and bitter brews learned from elders who read the land rather than the labels on cargo. The habit shifted when trade made sweetness cheap enough to become custom rather than festival. The city did not argue. It simply set out more glasses. Even the debate about firsts relaxes here. Historians still argue whether mint tea reached the libraries through scholarly ties to the north or by merchants whose bundles made a broader curriculum, but the argument sounds like two friends comparing paths that lead to the same threshold. Your glass is proof that arrival matters more than route. By the time you drain the last of your tea, the crust around the rim flakes lightly beneath your thumb. A tiny shard falls to the stone and disappears into the color of it. The boy gathers the tray, checks the pot's weight by feel, and balances the load with miniature adjustments you can feel in your own shoulders. He gives you the small nod that means the pause is finished. You answer with a nod that means you understood what the pause was for. As he glides away, a faint sugar shine remains on the threshold where the glasses sat. Ants will likely find it by afternoon and carry the sweetness away seed by seed. The lane knows how to make room for such processions. You stand and smooth the front of your robe with a palm that smells now of mint and copper. Ahead, the light has thickened again, but your mouth is cool. You pass once more the doorway where paper breathes in the shade, and the scents fold into each other with the ease of long neighbors. Tea for the tongue, books for the mind, and a city that measures both with a patient hand. You move on, not to leave the moment behind, but to let the next glass find you when it is ready. The lane beyond the tea, cellar's threshold narrows and darkens again, the walls leaning in until the sky is reduced to a narrow ribbon overhead. You walk slowly, letting your eyes adjust, noticing how the heat softens here, how the dust underfoot feels finer, like sifted flour. Somewhere ahead, the faint creak of a hinge opens and closes, followed by the dry shuffle of something being moved across a floor. The passage ends in a courtyard, no larger than a trader's stall. Its walls are high, their mud plaster marked by the slow, uneven polish of years. In the center, on a reed mat, sits a shallow basket brimming with scraps, fragments of leather bindings, loose pages, broken cords. They are the cast-off skin and bones of books, the sort of debris most eyes would skip over. But here, they are not treated as waste. An elderly woman sits beside the basket, her hands moving with unhurried purpose. She lifts each scrap of leather, turning it in her fingers, assessing whether it might patch another binding. Some pieces she sets aside in a small pile. Others she drops back into the basket, the sound soft and dry. Her robe is the color of old parchment, its sleeves rolled back to reveal forearms, lined with fine wrinkles that catch the light like shallow rivers. Beside her, propped against the wall, is a flat board with a low lip along one side. Several loose folios lie there, their edges crumbling. She picks one up carefully, brushes it with a cloth, and lays it flat beneath a smooth stone to coax it straight. You notice the faint sheen of beeswax on the cloth, its scent rising just enough to mix with the drier smell of paper. Timbuktu's manuscripts were not immune to the hazards of time, a fact as steady as the sun's return. Sand, insects, and careless hands could eat away at pages if they were not cleaned and wrapped. In many families, this work of tending to the wounded and worn was passed quietly from one generation to the next. Not always scholars, but caretakers, people who could tell at a glance if a page was worth saving, or if it had already given all it could. The woman pauses to untie a small bundle in front of her. The leather strap falls away to reveal half a dozen pages bound loosely at one corner. They are not a complete text, half a poem here, a section of law there, but the ink remains dark, the words legible. She hums softly, a sound without tune, as she smooths each one and stacks them neatly. Near her knee is a shallow bowl filled with a pale, granular powder. When she lifts a pinch between her fingers and scatters it lightly over a page, you catch the faint mineral scent of chalk. It will help absorb any lingering damp she tells you with a glance, though no words pass her lips. The motion is practiced, the layer even, and she leaves it there while she moves to the next folio. In the far corner of the courtyard stands a low wooden chest, its lid half open. Inside are neatly wrapped parcels, each tied with a colored thread. You notice that the colors vary: red, yellow, green, and wonder if they mark ownership, subject, or simply the cloth at hand that day. One bundle's thread is worn to a pale shadow of its original hue, the fibers frayed but still holding. From somewhere beyond the wall comes the faint bleating of a goat, followed by the sound of a child's voice, high, clear, and momentarily urgent. The woman looks up, smiles faintly, then returns to her work. Her hands keep the same pace, as if the world outside moves on its own schedule, and hers will not be hurried to match. Historians still argue whether these small acts of preservation, dusting, flattening, binding, were part of an organized practice across the city, or simply the accumulated habits of individual households. The written record is thin, but the evidence rests quietly in the survival of so many volumes. They were tended to, somehow, somewhere, by hands like these. A scrap of leather drops from her fingers to the mat, landing with a sound softer than a sigh. She leaves it where it is, as though it will decide for itself later whether to be useful. The air in the courtyard holds the mixed scents of beeswax, chalk, and warm clay. Above, the strip of sky brightens as a cloud moves away, letting sunlight fall in angled beams across the mat. The light finds the texture of the leather, the tiny wrinkles in her hands, the uneven edge of a folio, and settles there as if it has all afternoon. When you turn to leave, she does not look up, but her hand pauses long enough to press the beeswax cloth flat over the page she is working on. It is a small gesture, but it carries the weight of care that is older than the page itself. You step back into the lane, the sound of her quiet hum still folding itself into the air behind you. The lane beyond the caretaker's courtyard bends gently to the right, then narrows until you can place a hand on each wall at once. The air here feels heavier, the coolness fading as the morning edges toward noon. A faint hum rides the air, not the sound of voices, but something lower, almost like the inside of a seashell. You follow it without haste, feeling the heat gather behind you. The passage ends at a doorway framed in pale wood, its lintel carved with a simple line of repeating triangles. Inside is a room with no windows, lit instead by light filtering through an open roof panel above. The beam falls in a square onto the floor, bright enough to make the air in it shimmer. Around the edges of the room, deep shadow holds the shelves and the bundles they carry. You step inside, and the hum resolves itself into silence, real silence. The kind that lets you hear your own breathing, the shift of your robe, even the tiny scrape of your sandal against the packed earth. A small stool sits near the center, beside a low table that holds a single open manuscript. Its pages are wide, the script large and carefully spaced, with only a few lines on each sheet. The words describe the stars not in abstract, but as companions in the night sky, each one named, its seasonal appearances marked in a rhythm older than the city itself. In the margin, a narrow column of numbers runs alongside the text, perhaps noting intervals, perhaps something else entirely. The ink is a deep black, steady and full, but here and there you see a faint difference in shade, as though the scribe paused to refill the pen before continuing. Timbuktu's scholars often studied astronomy alongside theology, law, and medicine, a fact as steady as the North Star. In a city where the desert sky stretched unbroken for miles, the stars were both a clock and a map, guiding traders and scholars alike. You imagine the person who wrote this text pausing in their work to step outside and check the night for accuracy. Near the top of one page is a small mark, not part of the text, a thumbprint, faint but visible in the ink's margin. The whorls are smudged, the print probably made while turning the page too soon. It is a mistake that feels almost like a handshake across centuries. A narrow shelf against the far wall holds a row of small clay jars. Each is sealed with a disc of leather tied tight with string. You lift one and feel the fine grit on its surface, the cool weight in your palm. When you ease the leather aside, a faint scent escapes, dry, woody, with the sharpness of something ground from bark, perhaps pigment, perhaps incense to keep insects away from the paper. Beside the jars, a shallow basket holds folded palm leaves, their edges darkened by age. Some have writing on them, short lines scratched with a stylus, the letters shallow but neat. These may be notes, reminders, or teaching aids. The dry rustle they make when you lift one is almost like paper, but with a sharper edge, the sound of something that began its life in sunlight. From somewhere outside comes the muffled bleat of a goat, followed by the slow clap of wooden shutters closing against the heat. The sound is distant but steady, a rhythm you can feel in your ribs if you listen closely enough. Historians still argue whether manuscripts like the one before you, written in such large, open script, were teaching copies for beginners or ceremonial works meant to be read aloud in gatherings. The spacing could be for clarity, or for beauty, or simply the preference of the scribe. The uncertainty lingers in the air like a question left politely unanswered. The beam of light from the roof panel shifts slightly, its edge moving across the floor toward the table. You watch it touch the corner of the manuscript, the ink suddenly gleaming darker where the sun finds it. Dust floats lazily in the light, drifting in and out of view. You sit on the stool, the cool wood grounding you in the center of the stillness. The air smells faintly of earth, ink, and something harder to name, maybe the echo of nights spent under the stars, carried here on the pages themselves. You rest your hand lightly on the open folio without touching the text, feeling the faint rise of the stitching beneath the paper. When you leave, you step back into the narrow lane and look up. The strip of sky above is brighter now, the blue deeper, the sun climbing steadily. The hum you first heard is gone, replaced by the warmer buzz of a day settling into itself. You carry the silence of the room with you, a weightless thing that clings to your thoughts even as your feet move on. The lane ahead widens just enough to allow a shaft of sunlight to fall directly across your path. It pools on the packed earth like a shallow stream, making the dust in it gleam faintly as you pass. The walls here are higher, their tops edged with palm fronds laid flat to keep the wind from stripping the plaster away. From somewhere close comes the quiet bleat of goats, softer than the sound of footsteps. You turn a corner and see them, a small herd gathered in a shaded courtyard, their pale coats marked with swirls of dust. They move slowly, nosing at fallen palm leaves as if searching for the softest ones. The leaves crackle faintly under their mouths. A rope strung low between two posts keeps them from wandering into the open lane, though they show no sign of wanting to. At the far end of the courtyard, a doorway stands open. Just inside, you glimpse the edge of a low shelf and the corner of a woven mat. The air from within carries the faint, warm scent of paper, dry but still alive, as if it breathes through the narrow entrance. You step inside, and the goats barely look up. The room is cool and dim, its light coming from a single high window cut into the wall. Along the floor, near the shelf, are several bundles wrapped in soft leather, their surfaces rubbed to a muted sheen. One lies partly unwrapped, revealing a stack of loose folios. The top sheet shows neat lines of script framed by a decorative border in faded red and gold. The colors have dulled with age but still catch the light when you tilt the page. A shallow wooden bowl sits beside the bundle, filled with short strips of palm leaf and a length of goat sinew. You can see how the sinew has been twisted and dried into thin cords, ready for binding. It has a pale, translucent quality, like the inside of a shell. You touch it lightly and feel the faint give in the fibers, still pliable enough to use. Timbuktu's libraries sometimes relied on materials close at hand. A steady fact: goat sinew, once cleaned and prepared, was strong enough to bind pages without breaking, and could last decades if kept dry. Palm leaves too served as labels, bookmarks, or even improvised covers for smaller works. The knowledge of how to prepare and use them often lived in the same households that kept the books themselves. You kneel to look closer at the unwrapped folios. The ink here is darker than in the last room you visited, the script smaller and more compact, the spacing tight as though the scribe wanted to fit as much as possible onto each page. In the margin, a few words have been crossed out, not blotted, but marked with a single careful line, as if the writer wanted them to remain visible while signaling their removal. Near the doorway, a small clay jar without a lid rests on the floor. Inside are thin slivers of something pale, perhaps bone or horn. When you lift one, it feels cool and smooth, its tip worn slightly from use. These might have been tools for guiding the pen or for pressing folds into paper. The smell of the jar is faintly musky, the scent of something that once lived and walked. Outside, a goat shifts its weight, the rope creaking against the post. The sound blends with the faint rustle of the palm leaves in their mouths. It is a slow, patient music, one that doesn't ask for your attention but keeps it anyway. Historians still argue whether goat sinew was a common binding choice or a last resort when imported thread was scarce. Some believe it was simply practical, using what the desert offered. Others think it was reserved for certain types of works, perhaps those meant to stay within a household rather than travel. The manuscripts themselves offer no explanation. They simply endure with whatever they were given. You take a moment to rewrap the loose folios, tucking the leather carefully around them and securing the tie. The sinew knot holds easily, the fibers tightening without strain. You set the bundle back on the shelf, where it rests among its companions as though it has always been there. When you step outside, the goats are still at their leaves, the dust settling gently around their hooves. One lifts its head to watch you, chewing slowly, as if measuring your presence before deciding you are not worth interrupting its work. You leave them to it, stepping back into the lane where the sunlight has already shifted toward the opposite wall. The smell of leather and sinew follows you, faint but distinct, until the next bend in the path takes it away. The lane narrows again, pressing you toward a wall whose surface is warm to the touch. Your fingers brush its uneven texture, some patches smooth where new plaster was laid, others rough and pitted where the years have worked longer. The light ahead flickers, as if filtered through something that moves. When you turn the corner, you see why. Strips of woven reed hang loosely over a doorway, swaying in the faint breeze. You step through, brushing them aside, and the air changes. It smells faintly of ash dry, fine, and old as though something once burned here but long ago. The room you enter is dim, lit only by the thin spill of sunlight through a small opening high in the wall. Against the far side sits a low table, and on it lies a single manuscript. The edges of its pages are darkened, curling inward, as if the heat of a fire once kissed them. You kneel beside it. The parchment has a faint wave to it, like cloth left to dry unevenly. When you run your fingers along the outer margin, they come away with a trace of black dust. The smell is sharper here, smoke that has settled into the fibers so deeply it will never leave. The text is still legible, the ink holding its shape even where the edges have browned. The script is careful but slightly uneven, perhaps because the scribe wrote by lamplight or in haste. In the margin, there are a few short notes, their letters smaller and more cramped, perhaps added later. At the very bottom of one page is a small, almost invisible drawing, a palm tree, sketched quickly but with enough detail to show each frond bending in the same direction, as if under a strong wind. Timbuktu's manuscripts were no strangers to danger. A certain fact: fires, whether from accident or conflict, occasionally threatened collections. Some were saved in haste, others only in part. Many families kept the most precious works wrapped and stored high in walls, or buried in sealed jars during troubled times. This one may have been rescued half a moment too late, its edges singed but its heart intact. Beside the manuscript rests a narrow strip of cloth, stiff with soot. Perhaps it once wrapped the book, its fibers taking the brunt of the smoke. You lift it and feel how fragile it has become, its weave loose, its strength mostly gone. A small pile of ash sits in a shallow clay bowl nearby, the grains so fine they cling to your fingertips. From somewhere outside the room comes the sound of footsteps on hard ground, slow and measured. They pause, then move on. The silence afterward feels heavier, as though the walls themselves are remembering something. Historians still argue whether the singed manuscripts found in private collections today were damaged during known conflicts or in smaller, unrecorded accidents, lamps knocked over, cooking fires burning too close to stored bundles. The record rarely says, and perhaps it does not matter. What matters is that they survived at all. A narrow shelf against the wall holds two more bundles, both wrapped in plain leather. The ties are darkened in spots, but when you touch them, they feel strong. You leave them as they are, not wanting to disturb the stillness that seems to hold the room together. The beam of sunlight shifts, landing directly on the damaged page. The gold flecks in the border still catch the light, tiny sparks against the darker edge. You think of the hand that placed them there, never guessing that centuries later they would shine through a memory of smoke. When you rise to leave, the reed curtain brushes your shoulder. The smell of ash clings lightly to your robe as you step into the lane. The air outside feels brighter, thinner, and the warmth on your skin is clean. Ahead, you hear a faint, steady tapping, like the sound of a pen trimming its tip on stone. You follow it, the trace of smoke still in your breath. See, perhaps, at the far end, near a latticed window, a man sits on a reed mat with his back straight, a shallow tray before him. In the tray rests a manuscript, open to a page dense with text. His left hand steadies the folio, while his right hovers over it, holding a reed pen. The tip of his thumb is stained, a deep black, a crescent of ink that catches the light when he moves. He dips the pen into a small inkwell, taps it twice against the rim, there is your sound, and resumes his work. The text he's writing appears to be a commentary, its lines narrower than those of the main script, running in the outer margin. The ink is dark and new, a sharp contrast to the faded brown of the original hand. Every so often he leans back, studies the page, and then adds another small arc of letters, each one curved just enough to rest neatly between its neighbors. You sit near the wall and watch. The movements are deliberate, unhurried, each stroke a small act of trust between the page and the pen. The smell of fresh ink is stronger here, its resinous undertone warmed by the sunlight filtering through the lattice. Timbuktu scholars often worked like this, adding notes to earlier works rather than rewriting them entirely. A steady fact. These marginal commentaries could be as valuable as the text itself, preserving interpretations, local knowledge, and corrections gathered across decades or even centuries. In some cases, the commentary became the reason the manuscript was preserved at all. On the table beside him lies a strip of leather, its surface darkened where his inky fingers have rested between strokes. Next to it, a small clay cup holds a few reed pens at various stages of wear. One is trimmed so fine it could be used for the smallest of diacritical marks. Another has been cut broad, for titles or headings. You notice how his inky thumb occasionally presses lightly against the page as he turns it, leaving the faintest shadow of a print. Not dark enough to obscure the words, just a mark that says a hand was here, working. Over time, those small touches form a map of the scribe's presence, as distinct as his handwriting. Near the doorway, a folded cloth rests on a low stool. The corner of it is dark with old stains, perhaps from wiping a pen, perhaps from blotting a spill. Beside it sits a shallow wooden box, half filled with narrow slips of parchment. Some are blank. Others carry short notes in a quick, light hand reminders, perhaps, or phrases to be copied into the margin later. From outside comes the muffled sound of voices passing in the lane, followed by the creak of a cartwheel. The scribe does not look up. His attention is fixed entirely on the narrow space between his lines and the page's edge. Every so often he pauses, dips the pen, and taps the inkwell twice. The sound is so consistent that it becomes part of the room's rhythm. Historians still argue whether scribes preferred to add commentary directly to the main manuscript or to create separate companion volumes. The surviving works show both approaches. Here, in this room, there is no question these thoughts will live in the margin, close enough to speak directly to the text they follow. The sunlight through the lattice shifts, striping the page with pale bars. The ink in the fresh letters glistens for a moment before settling into the paper's fibers. You can almost see the moment when it dries, the shine fading to match the rest of the script. When he reaches the end of the margin, the scribe sets the pen down and flexes his fingers slowly, the way one might stretch after holding a weight. He closes the manuscript gently, smoothing the cover with the back of his inky thumb. The black crescent it leaves there is faint, but it will stay as long as the book does. You step back toward the doorway, careful not to cast your shadow across his work. Outside, the lane feels warmer, the air brighter, but the quiet precision of the scribe follows you, each step carrying the echo of pen tapping against inkwell, ink marking page, thought finding its place in the narrow space beside another's words. The lane dips and rises again, a shallow breath in the earth, and you come to a doorway shaded by a small awning of palm frond. Their edges are dried to the color of old straw, and they rattle softly when the breeze remembers them. You lift the latch and step into a room that smells faintly of plant fiber and dust warmed just enough to wake its scent. The light here is a patched quilt, slips of brightness filtered through a lattice high in the wall, stitched together by broad seams of shade. Along the floor, close to the wall, sit 3 low shelves. On the first shelf, bundles wrapped in leather rest like sleeping animals. On the second, stacks of palm leaf packets lie flat, tightened by thin cords that cross and knot in tidy X's. On the third, a scatter of tools, a bone folder worn to a gentle curve, a small knife with its edge kept cautious, a reed pen trimmed to a quiet point. You kneel and let your hand hover above the palm leaf stacks, feeling the way they hold the coolness of the floor. You slide one packet toward you and work the knot loose. The leaves open with a dry whisper, each strip pierced at 2 points, so a slender cord can keep them aligned. The surface holds a soft, fibrous sheen. The letters, inked in steady lines, ride the faint grain like boats on a low, calm swell. The script is small, the spacing patient, and where a word ran long, the scribe drew it slightly narrower rather than breaking the rhythm. At the end of each leaf, a brief flourish marks the pause. Nothing showy, just a small, confident flick that says, "We will continue." But first, a breath. Palm leaf is not a surprise here. A steady fact. Across West Africa, as well as in the broader Islamic world, readers used palm leaves as labels, bookmarks, teaching slips, and sometimes as the writing surface itself. In Timbuktu, where imported paper mingled with local materials, palm found its place in the margins and, on occasion, at the center. You turn a leaf, and the chords answer with a soft rasp. The sound lands between your ears like a familiar proverb. A small stamp no bigger than your thumbnail presses a simple mark into the lower corner of each leaf. It looks like a star, or perhaps a flower cut down to geometry. It may be a scribe's emblem or a household sign, the quiet claim that says, "This passed through our hands." You touch it lightly and feel the faint raised edge where the stamp met the softened fiber. A shallow basket sits nearby with spare leaves, some blank, some bearing practice lines. You select a blank one and lift it. It is surprisingly strong, bending and returning without complaint. On the basket's rim, a strip of palm has been split and twisted into a thin cord. Its end frays into a spray of fibers, pale as straw in early sun. You imagine a morning spent making cords like this, fingers learning the right pressure so the fibers twist together instead of splitting apart. From the adjoining courtyard comes a breeze that is more in tension than wind. It slides through the lattice and stirs the palm leaves to life. They answer with that dry, papery rustle, the one the room is named for in your head now, the sound of pages that are not pages, turning without being touched. It is a quiet music that finds its own time and plays it without asking. On the edge of the work table, a small bowl holds a paste the color of dilute milk. When you dip a fingertip, it feels slick and dries to a faint tack, leaving almost no residue. It might be the starch used to secure labels to leather wraps, or to mend a torn edge where a leaf split across its grain. Practical chemistry served in a courtyard bowl, the recipe passed along by gesture more than by text. You lift another packet, this one bound with a thin strip of dyed palm that holds a memory of green. The first leaf carries a title short, declarative, and beneath it an opening line about measures of grain and accounts settled at market. The palm surface takes the ink differently than paper. Lines are darker at their beginnings and tails, lighter where the pen skims. It reads like a voice that knows when to speak up and when to retreat. Historians still argue whether palm leaf booklets like these were copied locally to imitate forms seen farther east, or whether they were a practical adaptation born entirely here for lists, lessons, and drafts. Some suggest a trade of ideas rather than objects. Others imagine palm work, traveling bundled with spices and cloth, along slow routes that turned the Sahara into a long conversation. The leaves in your hands will not decide the argument. They will continue to be themselves quiet, serviceable, sufficient. A quirk lives in this room too. Hanging from a peg on the wall is a fan made from palm fibers bound into a broad oval. Its edge is stitched with leather, and the grip is wrapped so it fits a hand without thinking. You wag it once and feel the room respond, a small, immediate coolness that lifts dust and sends a quick sigh through the stacked leaf packets. You stop before the pages begin to gossip about it. A low cough from the doorway announces a visitor rather than an illness. An older man steps in, nods at you, and moves to the table with the careful authority of someone who has spent a life putting things down where they belong. He checks a cord, tightens a knot, then runs the side of his hand along the leaf edges to nudge them square. His thumb bears the faint stain that scribes carry, but today he is a keeper of cords, a reader of fibers. He straightens a bone folder so it points exactly toward the basket of blanks, not by rule, but because order here is a kind of tenderness. He pulls out a narrow slip inscribed with 2 lines of verse palm fibers darkened by ink, the words brief enough to memorize by the second read. He slots it into a leather-bound codex resting open on the table, where it will serve as a bookmark, a bridge of plant between plant and skin. You watch the way the leaf settles into the gutter and lies there quietly, not protesting the curve. A goat bleats somewhere outside, the sound making the lattice flicker in your peripheral vision. The man glances up, not because the goat asks anything of him, but because sound is an inventory item in rooms like this. He turns a packet so its title faces outward, then steps back as if to see whether the shelf agrees. The shelf agrees. You linger over one last palm leaf booklet, a series of brief questions and answers written for a student who preferred to keep lessons compact. Each line ends with a tiny mark half a circle, like a cup awaiting a pour that tells the eye to rest and then continue. The student's name appears once in a smaller hand, perhaps a correction written kindly. The moment is preserved in the thickness of the ink where the teacher's pen paused a fraction longer than the student's. You stack the packets as you found them. Trace the cords once with your fingertips and retie the soft X that keeps them orderly. The knot learns your hands quickly and pretends you have been here before. You place the bundle back on the shelf. The room rustles again, dry and companionable, palm acknowledging palm. When you step out, the awning fronds brush your shoulder, and the lane receives you with a light that has moved a finger's width across the wall. A grain of palm fiber clings to your sleeve like a pale thread, refusing to fall even when you shake your arm gently. You let it ride along. Some rooms prefer to come with you a little while longer. You return to a room you almost missed, the sort that prefers to be found only by people who step softly. Its door is plain, its threshold low, and the light within falls in a careful rectangle that stops halfway to the far wall, as if it has agreed not to intrude farther than necessary. Along that shadowed wall sits a chest, low, long, and quiet. The wood is a warm brown with a faint resin scent, something like dried needles and sun-warmed bark. Brass fittings run the length of the lid, dull with age, bright only where fingers have insisted. You stand still because some objects ask you to match their pace before they offer anything. The chest is banded with narrow strips of metal, each one fastened by small hammered studs. A keyhole sits inside a simple, flower-shaped plate. Its edges are softened by touch. On the floor beside the chest lies a short length of woven cord with a simple iron key attached. You notice the way the cord is bent around a body, often enough to learn the curve of a hip or the slope of a rib. It has been carried, not placed. You kneel, the cool of the packed earth reaching through your robe, and take the key in your hand. It fits the palm as if it has always planned to. The iron is smooth where skin has polished it, rough where rain once found it. You turn the key and the lock answers with a sound just above silence, metal moving against metal, softened by years of agreeing to the same motion. The lid lifts with a sigh of wood on wood. Inside, the air is cooler, dimmer, drier, the scent stronger. Leather that learned patience, paper that forgot hurry, and a faint thread of spice, like a clove hidden for company. Bundles lie in 2 neat rows, their leather wraps tied with cords that sit low and even. A few are labeled with palm leaf slips tucked under the ties. Others carry no tags at all, relying on the memory of the hand that packed them. In the corner of the chest rests a small cloth sachet. When you lift it, the smell of clove and something like dried orange lifts with it small defenses against insects that do not love spice. You set it back gently, and the sachet settles into the impression it has occupied for years, as if the chest remembers its shape. A steady fact fits here easily. By the 15th and 16th centuries, many families in Timbuktu maintained private libraries, passing manuscripts through generations the way others passed houses or wells. Some collections stayed near mosque schools. Others lived behind ordinary doors, like this one, guarded by habit more than by guards. You can feel that continuity in the way the bundles rest, not hidden from the household, but folded into it. You choose a bundle from the left row, not because it calls to you, but because it does not. Its tie loosens with a calm reluctance, and the leather opens to reveal folios stacked with a modest precision. The top page carries a table columns of figures aligned as neatly as jars on a shelf, the headings clear, the sums exact. Trade accounts, perhaps. Salt weights, cloth lengths, dates of delivery. Along the edge, a thin line in red separates one set from another. The red has faded to the color of damp clay, but it still holds the line. At the bottom of the second folio, a quick jot in a smaller hand notes something about wind and departure. The handwriting leans forward, eager to keep up with itself. A soft stain curves across the corner, as if a thumb once rested there in thought. You place your own thumb on the opposite corner, evening the page with a gesture that is not necessary but feels like good manners. A quiet quirk keeps company in this chest. Tucked under one bundle is a narrow strip of leather cut into the shape of a fish, its tail notched to a point. When you lift it, you find it is a bookmark, the body pressed flat and smooth. Someone absent-mindedly worked detail into its head, 2 dots for eyes, a line for a mouth, nothing more than a quick joke kept private among pages. You return it to its place, and the fish resumes its watch without complaint. Historians still argue whether households kept written catalogs for chests like this, a ledger noting title, subject, and place, or whether memory alone, shared among a few careful minds, held the order. Some point to brief lists tucked into bundles as proof of systematic care. Others call such slips exceptions. The chest does not say. It simply continues, sure that repeated hands can be a kind of index. You lift another bundle. The leather reveals a short collection of legal opinions, each one tidy and self-contained. In the margins, notes in a lighter ink add examples with a familiar tone: markets, marriages, gifts of land, details that belong to the street outside as much as to the text. Between 2 folios lies a folded square of cloth, thin and pale, pressed flat by time. You unfold it to find nothing written at all, only a clean sheet, once set to guard a page with gold in its border. The gold is there, small flecks that catch the light like sand that has remembered the sun. A fact that moves softly across rooms like this. When trouble approached, whether a season of uncertainty or a passing fear, families sometimes raised their libraries into chests and moved them deeper into houses, behind inner doors, even under floors. Some wrapped their most valued texts in oiled leather and sealed them in pots, confident that a page taught to wait would understand. The chest you lean over now looks built for such changing weather, low enough to slide, sturdy enough to take a new address without protest. You return the bundles to their rows. The cords settle into their grooves, and the leather shows the faint curve where it has always rested. At the bottom of the chest lies a narrow wooden tray with shallow compartments. One holds palm leaf labels, another spare cords, another a small vial of oil the color of old honey. You shake the vial once and scent rises unmistakably plant sweet, with a resin note beneath. A drop rubbed between fingers would teach a drying strap to bend again. You sit back on your heels and let the chest breathe. Light shifts across the lid's inner plank, brightening the grain in pale paths. The room listens well. It keeps the small sounds close, the faint tick of wood easing, a dry whisper as a cord settles, the distant suggestion of footsteps agreeing with the day. You watch dust make slow voyages through the air above the open mouth, particles rising and falling, as if the chest itself were exhaling. You think of keys again, and of the ways they wear their owners. A keeper might tie one to the waist, another might hide it in the fold of a sleeve, a third might tuck it into a small pocket, sewn into the hem of a robe. Some say elders slept with the key under a cushion, not from distrust, but because sleep is also a form of safekeeping. The chest does not require a story. It requires the same hand returning with the same key. You lower the lid. The hinges answer with that almost sound again, and the brass plate takes the key as if accepting a familiar gift. You turn it once, feel the brief resistance, and the lock agrees to hold. Your palm stays on the wood a few breaths longer than necessary, heat passing one way, cool passing the other. until both become the same temperature and the same unremarkable calm. When you stand, the room is unchanged except for what you now know about it. The rectangle of light remains respectful, the walls continue their plain duty, and the key lies where you will find it again. Outside, a breeze passes the doorway and leaves a small trail of cooler air behind it, like a hand resting on a page before turning it. You step into that path and follow it, bringing with you the faintest spice and the memory of brass that does not need to shine to be sure of itself. The lane carries you forward in a slow curve, its surface marked with the thin, wavering shadows of laundry lines strung between rooftops. A robe sways overhead, its hem frayed into soft tassels, brushing the air with each shift of the breeze. Beyond the curve, you find another doorway, its frame unpainted, its door absent, only a woven mat hung to block the light. You lift the mat aside and step into a room cooler than the lane, the air holding a quiet smell of leather and old paper, but also something else, an absence. The scent is thinner here, as if something that once lived in the space has been gone for a long time. The shelves along the far wall are not empty, but they are uneven. Where other rooms held neat rows of bundles, here there are gaps, places where the dust lies smooth, undisturbed by the rounded edges of stored manuscripts. Between the remaining bundles are small objects, a broken clasp, a palm leaf label with no cord attached, the flat oval of a dried seed pod. At the center of the room, on a low table, sits a single open folio. Its edges are worn smooth from turning, but the center of the page is still dark with ink. The text is steady, without ornament lines of legal rulings, brief and to the point. A few are marked in the margin with small dots, as if someone once intended to return to them. You lean closer and see that one dot has been smeared, a faint shadow of a fingertip crossing it. When you look up, you notice an older man seated on the mat in the corner. His robe is plain, his hands resting on his knees. He regards you with the calm of someone who has seen this room change shape many times. Without speaking, he gestures to the shelves palm up, a small, slow sweep of his hand. Timbuktu's libraries have always been vulnerable to absence, a steady fact. During times of upheaval, manuscripts could vanish into private hiding places, be sold to traders, or be lost entirely. Some returned years later, carried back by descendants. Others were never seen again. Families might remember the titles even when the pages were gone, holding the shape of the knowledge without the object itself. On one shelf, a single palm leaf label remains tied to nothing. Its edges are curled, the ink faint but legible. You turn it over and find a short line of script on the back, a note about a book kept with the blue leather. The leather is not here. You set the label down where you found it. The man in the corner shifts slightly and reaches for something beside him, a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. He unties it slowly, revealing a manuscript no thicker than your hand. The leather cover is cracked, the tie worn to threads. When he opens it, the pages lift unevenly, as if they have been kept closed too long. The first leaf carries a dedication written in a clear, deliberate hand, naming the owner and blessing the reader. The ink here is darker than the rest, as though this page was written at a different time, with a different care. He turns the pages slowly, showing you without speaking. A few are loose, sliding slightly when the book is moved. Some bear notes in the margin. Others are blank, except for a single word at the top, a subject heading perhaps, or a reminder for something never finished. Historians still argue whether gaps like the ones in this room represent loss or simply rotation books moved elsewhere temporarily, traded, or loaned for study. The truth may never be certain. Rooms like this live in both states at once. Absence is loss. Absence is movement. On the low table beside the open folio lies a small gourd filled with fine sand. A sliver of reed rests across its mouth. You realize it is an improvised ink dryer, the sand poured lightly over fresh writing to lift the moisture before the page is turned. When you tilt the gourd, the sand shifts with the soft sound of water poured far away. You set it back carefully. The man in the corner closes his manuscript and rewraps it, the tie finding its frayed knot without help. He places it in a cloth bag at his side. When he meets your gaze again, there is no urgency, no explanation, only the unspoken understanding that this room, as it is now, is one part of the city's long conversation with its books. You leave quietly. The mat falls back into place behind you, shutting the cooler air inside. In the lane, the shadows have moved, stretching farther across the ground. Somewhere ahead, you hear the faint rise and fall of voices, two people speaking low, perhaps debating a date, a name, a number worth remembering. The lane narrows again, its walls casting a deeper shade, and the voices you heard ahead take shape. Two men standing in a doorway, speaking softly but with the rhythm of long familiarity. One holds a palm leaf fan, moving it slowly in front of his face. The other leans against the wall, his arms folded, his gaze wandering to the strip of sky overhead. They pause when you pass, but do not stop their conversation, the words resuming like a thread simply picked up again. Inside the doorway is a room not unlike others you've seen, but its air is lighter, moving with a gentle current. Near the center stands a low table, and on it rests something you haven't yet encountered in this walk, a fan made of ostrich feathers. It is broad, oval, and pale, the quills bound together in a handle wrapped with dyed leather. The feathers shift slightly in the breeze from the open window, making the whole object breathe as if it has its own slow pulse. Beside the fan lies a small pile of leather scraps, some with stitching still attached. A strip of red cloth peeks from under one piece, its dye faded to the color of rust. On the floor nearby, a shallow wooden tray holds a stack of loosely folded cloths, each one dusty but clean enough to handle manuscripts without leaving oils from the skin. A man sits cross-legged on the far side of the table. His task is simple, keeping the fan moving to clear the air of dust before it can settle on the pages he's sorting. The movement is unhurried, the sweep long and even, with a slight pause at the end of each stroke. The air the fan stirs is cool, carrying the faint scent of leather and the sharper, almost citrus-like note of freshly scraped hide. Timbuktu's desert climate was both a protector and a danger to its manuscripts. A steady fact, while dryness preserved ink and paper, wind-blown dust could work its way into every fold and binding, wearing pages down grain by grain. Simple tools like a fan were essential, and ostrich feathers, flexible, broad, and soft, were valued for this work, more than for any display. The man's left hand rests on a stack of small folios bound with palm fiber cord. Every so often, he lifts the top one and fans a few pages gently with the feathers before setting it aside. The dust that rises is faint, more a suggestion in the light than a visible cloud. But you can smell it. Dry earth, far traveled, older than any of the walls here. On a narrow shelf to your right, a clay jar holds a bundle of spare feathers, their tips clean and even. They lean at a slight angle, their quills bound together loosely with cord, ready to replace the ones on the fan when wear takes its edge. Next to the jar is a smaller vessel, its mouth covered with a square of cloth tied down with string. The cloth smells faintly of cloves, a reminder that air here is managed with as much care as the manuscripts themselves. The fan's motion changes for a moment, shorter, quicker strokes, aimed at a page where dust has clung stubbornly to the margin. The man tilts the folio toward the light, finds the grain of the paper, and brushes until the last speck releases its hold. Then the fan returns to its longer rhythm, the work folding back into the room's slow breathing. A narrow beam of sunlight falls across the table, catching the curved edge of the fan and the pale shimmer of the feathers. They look almost weightless in the light, though you can hear the faint whisper they make when they pass through the air. The sound is steady enough to become part of the room's silence. Historians still argue whether feather fans were common tools in most private libraries or a mark of the largest collections, where a dedicated caretaker could tend to the manuscripts without other duties. Surviving references suggest both. In some households, the same hands that swept the courtyard also swept dust from pages. In others, the role belonged to someone whose work was entirely within the walls of the library. You watch the man complete another slow sweep, then set the fan down across his knees. He rests his hands on it lightly, not because it might fall, but because it belongs there until the next page is ready. He meets your eyes briefly and gives a small nod toward the door, not dismissal, but the quiet acknowledgement of someone who must keep a rhythm unbroken. Stepping back into the lane, you notice how the air outside feels warmer, heavier, without the fan's movement. A breath of wind passes once, stirring the dust, then leaves it to settle again. Ahead, another wall waits with a doorway half in shadow, and you find yourself already wondering what sound will live inside it. You find the next doorway by accident, which is often the best way. Your shoulder grazes a patch of cooler plaster, and your fingers discover a wooden latch with the smoothness of a stone found in a river. The door yields, and you step into a room that smells different from the others. Less leather, more plant, less oil, more dust caught inside fiber. The light is generous here, falling through a high slit like water from a ladle, brightening a long table where sheets lie stacked in uneven piles. Paper, not bound yet, not written yet, just sheets waiting to become a voice. You move closer and let your palm hover above the nearest stack, the way one holds a hand over a brazier to read the heat. The top sheet is creamy, with tiny specks that keep it from pretending to be a cloud. Its edges are soft, not feathered, as if a careful knife learned to be kind. When you lift it, the page is firm without stiffness, and it answers your bend with a polite memory rather than a crease. You hold it up to the light, and a faint pattern slips forward, parallel lines, then others crossing them like the shallow grid of a field, laid in chain lines. In one corner, almost shy, a watermark emerges, a shape like a crescent balanced on a stem. You blink, and it fades back into the page, the way distant dunes vanish when the air decides to shimmer. Timbuktu's pages did not all begin in Timbuktu. A steady fact: much of the paper that scholars and merchants used reached this city from far ports, Fez, Tlemcen, Cairo, sometimes even from across the sea, carried by traders whose camels learned the steps of salt and gold and words. The city gathered these sheets the way a well gathers clouds, by reputation first, then by habit. You set the page down as if not to disturb the root still sleeping in it. On the table, a small knife rests beside a polished bone folder that has worn itself into a crescent. A reed pen lies there too, trimmed but as yet innocent. Beside the tools sits a shallow bowl of dust, the color of light bread crust starch for sizing, perhaps, or ground chalk to temper a surface that wants to drink ink too quickly. You pinch a little between finger and thumb and feel how it disappears cleanly, leaving nothing to complain about. The next stack is different. Its surface shows less speckle, more gloss. When you lift a sheet and tilt it, it shines for a moment like water with the sun on it. The laid lines are farther apart, the chain lines heavier. You hold it higher to the window slit, and a watermark steps out more boldly. A simple ox head with a small cross between its horns. A quirk of paper that traveled wide across centuries. Italian mills first, then beyond, their marks turning into quiet passports. You imagine the sheet at the beginning of its life, pulp poured into a mold, water pressed away, fibers learning to hold hands. Now it waits on a table in a desert city to meet a pen from a river reed, far and near, sharing a surface. At the table's far end, a narrow basket holds palm leaf slips, each cut with a small notch. You recognize them as labels for stored paper sizes, long, square half sheets. One slip bears a handwritten note for letters to traders. Another says, for lessons. No one has made this room a mystery. It is a pantry, and paper is grain. A steady breeze sneaks through a crack, and the top sheets twitch with a very small impatience. You lay a reed across one pile the way one would lay a finger across a child's lips. The paper calms. A quiet practice waits beside the wall. 3 sheets hung by their corners on a line of cord, drying after a thin wash of starch. Their surfaces look duller, less hungry for ink perhaps. The clothespins are not quite pins, just bent slivers of palm with a twist of sinew. You touch one, and it answers with a faint creak, then settles back into its task of holding on. A modest, homey quirk keeps company in this room. A narrow box filled with torn corners, triangles of paper saved from trimming. The triangles bear tiny watermarks, crescent, ladder, a star with too many points to count at a glance. Someone has been playing a manufacturer's little game, holding each sheet to the light before cutting, keeping the corner with the ghost as if to collect weather from factories no one here will ever see. You take one between finger and thumb, and the ox head returns, thin as a rumor and just as persistent. A collector's habit without ambition. You think of the travel behind these stacks. Bales loaded onto carts near rivers that do not know sands. Lists copied into the neat columns of an accountant who would never taste sand on his teeth. Ships breathing with the sea. Ports where the smell is all salt and rope. And then, much later, caravans, days and days of measured steps, bells, leather, the arithmetic of water. And then this table, this slit of light, this quiet inventory. Historians still argue whether European papers became common in Timbuktu in the same centuries as the great teaching houses flourished, or whether they surged later, when trade found new paths and prices lowered. Some catalogers find watermarks here that tug dates forward. Others caution that paper sits in cupboards before it meets a pen, and that a sheet could live 2 lives before the scribe gave it a 3rd. The question is comfortable in this room. It can sit on a stool and watch you count the chain lines without taking a side. You settle into a slow routine with the table, as if you belong to it. Lift a sheet, show it the light, learn its secret, lay it down. The room's other sounds keep pace. A small cough from the courtyard, a pigeon shuffling along the lintel outside, the faintest scuff of your sleeve against the table's edge. You could stay here a long time and never run out of pages to greet, a fact the hand enjoys. Some sheets wear sizing that makes ink ride their surface just a heartbeat before sinking in, so that letters sit up proud for a moment, like newly baked loaves. Others drink immediately, the lines settling at once to a flat confidence. Scribal taste chose between them the impatient preferred one, the exacting another. You imagine 2 scholars friendly in everything except paper, borrowing each other's books and muttering in the margins about the other's choices. At the rear of the room stands a small chest with an open lid. Inside lie narrow, long sheets cut to a particular width letter strips. By the look of them, a palm slip label says simply, "For the road." The idea pleases you the way words can travel lighter when paper does. A small economy of fiber and thought. You hold one last sheet to the light and find a watermark you haven't seen yet. A hand with a cuff, palm open, fingers splayed. It appears suddenly and then relaxes back into blankness. You think of all the hands that have moved this page, the one that formed the pulp, the one that lifted it from the mold, the one that stamped it dry, the ones that counted, bundled, traded, carried, the ones that will eventually write. The ghost hand within the sheet is just one more in a crowd. You set the paper down and smooth the top stack once, not because it needs smoothing, but because the gesture tells the room you are finished for now. A light trace of fiber stays on your fingertips, a softness like flour. You rub thumb and forefinger together, and it disappears into the day. Before you leave, you glance back at the drying line. One sheet moves a fraction, as if agreeing with your choice to stop. The slit of light has shifted halfway to the wall, a slow, steady promise that the room will be warm by afternoon. Paper has its own weather, even here. The door opens onto brightness, and the air outside tastes briefly of heat in far places. You step into it, carrying nothing visible but a memory of invisible marks water that drew grids, mills that left ghosts, roots that wrote themselves into the fibers. Somewhere up the lane, a voice recites a list in an even tone, and you realize that the city speaks like paper too. Laid lines of habit, chain lines of trade, watermarks of memory that show themselves only when you tilt your head toward the light. The lane tilts slightly upward, leading you toward a cluster of walls so close together that the air between them feels almost compressed. A narrow door appears on your left, its wood weathered pale and its hinges creaking once when you push it. Inside, the air is cooler and heavier, with a scent you recognize immediately, charcoal and resin, the ghost of countless ink pots. The room is small, its walls bare except for a narrow shelf running along one side. On that shelf sit several shallow clay bowls, each darkened on the inside with the residue of something ground fine. Beside them are pestle short, rounded stones that fit the palm so well they seem grown for it. In the corner, a low stool stands before a wooden block scarred from long use, its surface marked by rings where jars once sat. On the block is an inkwell carved from a length of hollow bone. The ends are capped with thin discs of wood, one fitted with a small hole just wide enough for a reed pen to pass. You lift it and smell the faint mineral tang of iron mixed with the sweet resin of gum arabic. Inside, you can hear the slow slosh of liquid that has waited in the dark for its next page. Timbuktu's scribes mixed their inks in many ways, but a steady fact is that soot, charcoal, or lampblack provided the deep black most prized for manuscripts. Gum Arabic drawn from acacia trees bound the pigment to the page, while water gave it life enough to flow. The proportions varied by habit and season. The ink was as personal as the handwriting it carried. On the floor beside the block sits a shallow basket half filled with lumps of gum Arabic, their surfaces amber clear in places, cloudy in others. When you pick one up, it is light, almost weightless, and its scent is faintly sweet, like honey left in the sun. The texture is brittle until it warms against your fingers, where it grows tacky. You imagine a scribe dropping a lump into a bowl of water, watching it dissolve into the liquid like memory into conversation. A second basket holds charcoal sticks, each no longer than your finger. Some are smooth cylinders, others jagged, as though snapped mid-use. The dust clings easily, leaving a fine shadow on your skin. You can almost hear the grinding sound these would make under the pestle, the slow transformation from solid to powder fine enough to flow like ink's shadow. On the far side of the shelf is a jar sealed with wax. Its label, in a quick, sure hand, reads simply, "Red." You ease the lid aside and find powder the color of clay after heavy rain, perhaps cinnabar, perhaps red ochre. Such pigments were used sparingly, for headings, for borders, for the marks that tell a reader where to begin and end. A scrap of palm leaf rests on the block, covered with short lines of test writing in different shades of black and brown. The letters are casual, not meant to last loops and strokes to judge the ink's flow before it touches the real work. The darker lines are fresh, the paler ones softened by weeks of dust. You run a fingertip along one and feel the slight rise of dried gum. From outside comes the low thud of something heavy set down on stone, followed by the shuffle of sandals. The sound fades, leaving the room's own rhythm intact. The occasional creak of wood as the block shifts, the faint settling of powder in a bowl. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's inks always followed the same recipes or whether each family guarded its own variations. Some records speak of ingredients traded from far afield: indigo, saffron, even fragments of copper blended into black to give it warmth or sheen. Others suggest that the finest inks were the simplest, their endurance a result of restraint. Near the block is a small cup with a reed pen resting across it. The tip is split and stained, the fibers flaring slightly where the ink has worked its way in. You can see how the edges have been trimmed again and again to keep the line sharp. Next to the cup, a thin strip of cloth, darkened in places, waits for the excess ink to be wiped away before a fresh dip. On the wall above the block hangs a short wooden rod with 2 loops of cord. You realize it is a holder for drying reed pens, the cords keeping them from resting on their tips. Several pens hang there now, each bearing the faint polish of long use. The ends where they once grew from the reed are cut neat, almost ceremonial. A small quirk hides in plain sight. One of the pestles is not stone at all, but a piece of smooth bone, its end rounded by years of grinding pigment. The surface has absorbed the dark of charcoal, the red of ochre, the faint yellow of something you cannot name. It is a tool that carries its own record in color. You set it back gently. The light from the door has shifted, catching the curve of the bone inkwell so it gleams for a moment before returning to shadow. You imagine a page somewhere in the city waiting for this ink lines that will dry into permanence, black that will still hold its edge centuries from now. When you step out, the air feels warmer, brighter. The scent of resin and charcoal clings faintly to your hands. Down the lane, you can see the blur of movement near another doorway, perhaps another keeper, another craft. The city's manuscripts do not live in shelves alone. They begin in rooms like this, where powders meet water and patience turns to ink. The lane bends again, curling between walls that lean close enough to trade shade. You follow it until the light brightens at the far end, where a doorway stands open beneath a small arch of carved wood. The carving is simple interlaced lines forming a shallow frame, but the wood is dark and polished, as if many hands have touched it on their way in. Inside, the air feels softer, and it takes a moment to realize why. A cat is sleeping in the center of the room, its body curled into a neat circle on top of an open ledger. The pages beneath it are half covered by its tail, the inked lines just visible under the arch of its back. The slow rise and fall of its breathing creates the illusion that the writing itself is alive, swelling slightly, then settling. The room is modest, its shelves holding a small number of manuscripts and a few stacks of folded paper. A reed pen lies across a sheet on the low table, as though someone meant to continue writing but decided not to disturb the cat. The pen's tip points toward the sleeping curve of fur like an arrow in a quiet diagram. On the shelf nearest you sits a wooden box, its lid propped open to reveal small clay jars with fitted corks. The jars are labeled in a fine, careful hand: black, red, gum, sand. Each label is darkened at the edges, the ink feathered slightly into the grain of the paper. You lift one jar and find it unexpectedly warm from the sunbeam that has been lying across it. Inside, the powder shifts with a soft sigh. The cat flicks an ear but does not lift its head. Its whiskers tremble slightly, perhaps chasing some imagined bird in a dream. You notice one paw rests directly over a line of writing, as if holding it in place. The text beneath is a list: names, dates, and short notes, each followed by a brief mark in the margin. It could be a borrowing record, a trade account, or a catalog. The handwriting is brisk, with the kind of confident slant that suggests the writer rarely hesitates. Timbuktu's manuscripts were often part of living collections, not static displays. A steady fact: many family libraries doubled as lending repositories, where texts could be borrowed for study or copied in exchange for another manuscript, goods, or sometimes a promise. Records of these exchanges survive, sometimes tucked between unrelated folios, sometimes carefully maintained in ledgers, like the one now doubling as a pillow. You move to the far shelf, careful to keep your steps quiet. Here, several bundles are stacked neatly, each tied with cord made from twisted palm fiber. The knots are small, efficient, with the ends tucked away rather than left loose. One bundle is wrapped in cloth printed with a faint, repeating pattern of crescent shapes, so faded it might be mistaken for wear at first glance. On the table near the cat is a small dish filled with smooth stones, each no larger than your thumb. They vary in color: pale gray, deep brown, a few with a faint reddish cast. Perhaps they serve as weights to keep pages from curling, or perhaps they are simply pleasant to hold while reading. One rests on the corner of another open folio, pinning it without touching the ink. From outside the doorway comes the faint scent of baking bread, warm and slightly yeasty. It slips into the room and mixes with the smell of paper, ink, and the faint musk of the sleeping cat. The combination is oddly grounding, as though the day's work and the day's meal have agreed to meet here in this air. Historians still argue whether the presence of animals in manuscript rooms was tolerated or discouraged. Some note the occasional paw print or hair pressed into a page. Others argue that any careful keeper would keep animals away from such spaces. But here, the arrangement seems mutual. The cat takes its place without apology, and the manuscripts continue to exist without complaint. The cat stirs, stretches, and shifts its weight. For a moment, you glimpse the rest of the line beneath its paw, a note about return before the festival. The pen on the table rolls slightly, bumping against the edge of the paper. The cat blinks once at you, then curls back into its original position, effectively closing the ledger again. You stand still a moment longer, then step quietly back toward the doorway. The sunlight outside seems brighter after the muted calm of the room. The smell of bread is stronger here, curling down the lane toward another corner. Somewhere ahead, there will be another door, another page, perhaps one watched over by a different kind of keeper. You move toward a doorway where light spills in narrow bands, as though someone has combed the sun with a fine reed and laid the teeth across the wall. The threshold is low, and when you step inside, you feel the temperature drop by a small, loyal degree. The room is long and narrow, a corridor more than a chamber, with shelves running along one side at knee height. Across from them, a window cut high into the wall breathes daylight through a lattice of woven reeds. The beams slant like patient ladders, climbing the room from floor to ceiling in quiet increments. Dust dances in the bars of light, each mote turning once as if bowed by custom. The shelves hold their familiar population bundled manuscripts, a scattering of tools, a folded cloth, but the light grants them new titles. The leather wraps become low hills, the cords are dry rivers, The cloth gleams like parched moonlight. The breeze pressing through the reed window carries a faint sweetness baked earth. Chalk, a thread of the palm mat scent that clings to rooms where feet behave. You sit on the floor where the light meets the shade. Your knees find the coolness. Your elbows find the warm edge. Across the nearest bundle, someone has slipped a palm leaf label. The script on it is neat, the ink faintly reddish, and you hear, in its measured curves, a voice that prefers to show rather than to tell. You lift the bundle and set it in the light so the chords glow pale and the knots cast tidy shadows, like punctuation that has learned manners. The leather loosens with a sigh you have begun to trust. The folios beneath are thick, their edges a little uneven but honest. The first page you open presents a map made of words, no coastline drawn. Only place names arranged along named distances and wind directions. The cities move across the page like beads on a cord. Walata, Takeda, Gadams, Fez arrows and notes aligning them with the season's wind. Timbuktu has always pressed its ear to distant places, its scholars trading letters and texts along the same routes that carried salt and gold. A steady fact, by the 16th century, correspondences linked scholars here, with peers in Fez, Cairo, and beyond. Knowledge traveled in caravans' wake, folded in leather, weighted by seals rather than stones. You pause and let the reed lattice stripe the map with light. The page looks like a city seen through blinds at noon. A thin note in the margin mentions the wind that blows like a patient guest, likely the harmattan, though the scribe gives no name, only mood. Another line marks the days best suited to begin a journey, the letters small and sure, as if copied from someone who had tested the advice with sore feet and a contented camel. Across the next folio, a poem rides the top margin, perched above legal commentary like a bird that refuses to choose between song and shade. The hand is different, looser, happier to curve where the commentator liked angles. You mouth one phrase silently, and the vowels tread softly over your tongue. A quirk lives here. In the lower corner, a thumb-sized stamp, faint as a dream, shows a gazelle with a raised foreleg, likely a household mark, or perhaps just a scribe's private flourish. You think of the fish bookmark in the chest, of watermarks in paper, of ostrich feathers breathing dust away. The city collects animals in quiet emblems, as if to anchor text with small remembering bodies. The breeze lifts, and the reeds answer with a low hiss, like distant rain. The light bars shift a finger's width across the floor. In that tiny drift, you notice something else. The room's sound changes as the light does grain by grain, brighter where the bars fall, deeper where the shade holds. A reed lattice is a practical choice, cooling without opening the door to wind, but it is also a metronome for rooms. You feel your breath matching its measure. You run a fingertip along a torn edge at the folio's base. The tear is old, and someone neat and anonymous once mended it from behind with a thin strip of paper. The join is clean. The words cross the scar without stuttering. There is patience stitched into mends like this, the sort that prefers to be invisible. You return the page to its place and lift another, where a list of scholars appears: names, lineages, teachers of teachers. Some are followed by short notes in smaller hands, a city lived in, a legal opinion preferred, a date guessed at carefully. Historians still argue whether these lists were compiled in one sitting by a meticulous hand, or whether they grew like vines over years, each new reader adding a leaf. The uneven ink shades whisper for the latter, but the room does not insist. A small tray near the shelf holds a string stretched with 4 knots. It looks like nothing until you lift it and feel in your fingers the difference between each knot's tightness, their spacing deliberate. A counting aid perhaps for folios lent or pages copied simple arithmetic saved in fiber. You roll one knot between thumb and index finger, and it yields just enough to confirm the mind it served was careful, not rigid. You place the string back and let your eyes climb to the window. Through the reeds, the sky is a quilt of pale squares. A bird's wing crosses and vanishes. The breeze brings the smell of something faintly sweet, dates warming in a basket, perhaps, and for a moment the city's outside world touches the manuscript's inside world with a soft, brief handshake. A page later, you find a line drawn in red ink beneath a verse of law, then another in black correcting the red, then a note that walks both back a pace, suggesting a different reading altogether. Margins here are not borders. They are living rooms where voices sit. A steady fact. In campuses like Sankore, and in private rooms like this, text and comment live together as habit law beside proverb, astronomy beside memory, so that learning felt less like a ladder and more like a woven mat. You lean closer to the lattice and let the light pattern your hands. The bars make your fingers look like shelves. It matches the room's temperament. Everything here is held, not trapped, slowed, not stopped. You pull the bundle's tie down the page as a weight, and the cord leaves a straight, temporary shadow across the ink. A drafted line without ambition. A whisper of superstition slips into the day. Tucked into the corner between wall and shelf is a small charm. 2 beads and a sliver of bone strung on colored thread, the kind an ant might tie quietly near a doorway with a soft, "Let the pages rest easy," fringe or faith. People will disagree, but the charm has chosen to remain, and the manuscripts have chosen not to object. The city is full of such neighborly arrangements. Another uncertainty prefers the shade. A single folio bears a note that dates a certain scholar's visit to Timbuktu differently than a ledger in a different room. The two cannot both be right unless time learned how to bend for courtesy. Scholars still argue whether the discrepancy marks 2 visits, a copying error, or the way seasons can turn a month into a moving target across routes. The read window makes a grid of the problem and offers no solution. Some questions keep the light lively. You leave the bundle loosely open and simply watch the bars creep. In their slow march, hours and paragraphs learn each other's pace. A fly swims through one bright lane and flings itself into shadow, forgetting where it meant to go. The floor holds the geometry steady. The shelf lowers its head politely and receives another drift of dust. When you rewrap the folios, your hands have learned the read pattern so thoroughly that the tie finds its notch without your eyes. You set the bundle down exactly where it felt it belonged. The label faces outward, the cord ends tucked, the map of words sleeping under a map of light. Before you stand, you place your palm in a bright bar and let it warm, then slide it into shade and let it cool. The difference is an education you can have without reading. In a desert city, knowledge keeps to the lines where air moves, paper breathes, and sun arrives measured. You step back into the lane, and the bars vanish into ordinary brightness, but your eyes keep their memory for a few breaths. The sky is now a whole square rather than many small ones. The breeze feels less like a voice and more like a hand on your shoulder. Somewhere ahead, a door closes, with the soft authority of wood that has learned to comply. You follow the sound, carrying with you a grid that no one else can see, and a page where place names still exhale slowly in the shade. You follow a low thread of voices into a room that behaves like a pause. The doorway is narrow, the lintel plain, and the air inside smells of paper that has learned patience. 2 men sit on opposite sides of a low table, the table itself balanced on 3 short legs, as if refusing to take a side. Between them rests an open folio and a string of date pits arranged in careful increments. 5, then 2, then 1, like a small caravan that cannot decide when to depart. The men are not angry. Their words move like a palm fan in warm air. Back, forth, back again. One is older, his beard gone the color of unbleached linen. The other is younger, his fingers stained where ink has been more faithful than soap. The older man taps the page with a reed trimmed so fine it could thread a needle. The younger one answers by nudging a date pit forward with one fingertip, then folding his hands as if to keep them from saying more. You sit against the wall, content to be furniture. The folio between them bears a neat hand and a title that repeats a familiar claim about a scholar's visit to Timbuktu. The line that worries both men lies near the bottom, where a date is given in lunar terms, followed by a marginal note written in a different ink. The note corrects the lunar month and shifts the year by 1. The error is small enough to feel polite, but time in a contested line is like a cracked bowl, still useful, still beautiful, but worth a closer look before you pour. A steady fact offers itself gently. Scholars in 16th century Timbuktu corresponded widely, north to Fez and Tlemcen, east to Cairo, trading letters, opinions, and sometimes their own footsteps. Records survive that place, notable teachers and students in the city During those bright decades when Sankore thrived and private libraries swelled, the older man recites a short chain of names, teacher of teacher, student of student, as if he were laying stones across a stream, expecting you to trust the crossing because he has walked it before. The younger man replies with a list of moons. He traces them with his pen on the table, drawing circles you can't quite see, naming the days when the crescent should have been first sighted. He speaks as if the sky keeps an account book and the horizon signs its entries. Then he touches the marginal note again, the one that shifts the year by a breath, and lets his finger rest there the way a reader rests at line's end. Between them, the date pits become counters: arrival, departure, the time required to copy a text, the number of days a caravan would need if the wind were sullen. The older man moves 2 pits together and nods at the leather tie on a neighboring bundle. The younger one separates them again and points to a short line in the margin that mentions a festival, then mimes the path of the moon with a quick curve of his hand. You feel the city's calendar move in your ribs the way drums do when they behave themselves. On a nearby shelf sits a small gourd with a narrow spout. When you lift it, you find it holds fine sand, the kind used to dry fresh ink. The gourd makes a soft sea sound when you tilt it, and then a hush when you set it down. You place it carefully on the table's quieter corner, where the negotiation will not spill it. A quirk drifts in on a thread of sun. A slip of palm leaf tucked into the folio bears a proverb written side. Long, even the straight road bows to a dune. Someone added a tiny sketch beside it. 2 dots for a caravan's eyes, a line for a horizon. It is commentary without credentials, and it leaves both men oddly calmer when they notice it. The younger one smiles despite himself. The older man clears his throat in a way that concedes nothing and acknowledges everything. They turn the page. The script there is the same hand but a cooler ink, as if the scribe paused for tea and returned with steadier breath. A list of gifts follows: books bundled for a teacher, a jar of ink that holds its line, a swatch of dyed cloth folded with a blessing. The younger man traces the list with the back of his nail and counts days again in pits. The older one raises the reed and measures distances as if a pen could be a compass when the table is the sea. Historians still argue whether such contradictions date here, date there, festival mentioned, moon miscounted mark errors, later corrections, or simply the way travelers' time slips when routes stitch together seasons from different cities. Lunar months never sit exactly on the shelf. Sighting is part astronomy, part weather, part human eyes. The debate here is generous, precisely because the city remembers how the sky behaves, with fidelity and with mischief. Outside, someone passes the doorway carrying a tray of glasses, and a ribbon of mint rides the air across the table. The older man pauses long enough to let the smell fade. The younger one gently rearranges the pits again, then pinches one between forefinger and thumb, sets it to the side, and says nothing. The subtraction means, allow for a late departure. The older man nods once, slow. He moves a pit of his own. It means, and for a letter that waited 2 nights in a bag before being read. A steady fact returns, softer than the first. Timetables here have always been braided scholars' plans, caravan winds, market days, rain that comes or does not. Manuscripts follow those braids. The line that proves a date often proves a habit instead, and habits invite exceptions the way shelves invite dust. You accept this not as compromise but as craftsmanship. A city's calendar stitched like leather, sturdy, flexible, forgiving at the corners. The older man finally leans back and rests his reed across the folio like a bridge closed for repairs. The younger one lines the pits into 2 neat rows, what the page says, what the note claims, and leaves a small space between them that looks, to you, exactly the width of a polite disagreement. They do not shake hands. They do not declare victory. They simply breathe in the same room and agree, without saying so, to keep the folio open on this spot for a few days more. A cat passes the doorway with the self-possession of an authority who neither needs nor gives dates. Its tail writes a brief line on the threshold and erases it with the next step. Somewhere, a drum tests a single beat and then thinks better of it. The room returns to its ordinary hum, reed against margin, page against air, breath against silence. Before you leave, the older man slides the palm leaf slip back into the page with deliberate care, as if tucking an elder back into bed. The younger one collects the pits into a small pouch and ties it with a knot that looks practiced, not hurried. He sets the pouch on the folio's edge, where it will remind them both that questions can ripen like dates and be sweeter for it. You step into the lane. The sun has inched forward a respectful thumb width. Shade pools along the wall like ink that has decided not to run. Behind you, the voices resume at a lower volume that sounds like weather present, persistent, harmless. You walk on, carrying in your pocket an imaginary pit you did not take, to worry with your thumb when the next uncertainty politely asks for a chair. The lane narrows until you have to turn your shoulders slightly, your fingertips brushing the warm plaster on either side. At the end, you step into a courtyard so small, it feels like a room without a ceiling. The walls are the color of dry clay, and from their tops hang faint strands of vine that sway when the wind bothers to pass. In the center sits a low stone basin, its surface shallowly carved with geometric patterns, the grooves filled with fine dust rather than water. Against the far wall, beneath a strip of hanging shade cloth, lies a chest, its lid half open, one hinge straining as if it has forgotten how to close entirely. You walk toward it, and the ground shifts underfoot from hard-packed earth to a mat woven from palm fronds. The mat's edges are frayed, its pattern faint but still polite enough to greet you. Inside the chest are bundles of paper, smaller than most folios you've seen so far. They are tied with cords dyed in different colors: red, green, indigo, pale gold, each perhaps marking a category known only to the keeper. One bundle is so loosely tied you can see the corner of a page peeking through. The paper is thicker than usual, its edges softly curved from use, and its surface bears a faint sheen as if it has been handled more than read. You lift the bundle and sit on the edge of the mat. The first page opens onto a recipe not for food, but for a kind of ink that claims to catch the eyes of those who forget to see. It lists soot from a lamp that burned date, palm oil, gum from a tree that leans toward the east, water drawn at dawn, and a single petal from a hibiscus that has not yet opened. You picture someone waiting in the dim hour before sunrise, watching for the bloom to loosen, plucking the petal as if lifting a seal from a letter. A steady fact: Timbuktu scribes and ink makers often favored locally sourced materials for their work, but there are records of ingredients arriving by caravan, rare pigments, gum of unusual clarity, even shells ground to powder for certain shades. Recipes could be practical, poetic, or both, and some were guarded like family heirlooms. Further in the bundle, you find small pages covered with short notes, lists of proverbs, bits of verse, lines copied in different hands as if for practice. One reads, "A page without margin is a mouth without breath." Another, "Ink has more patience than speech." In the corner of one page, someone has drawn a tiny hand holding a reed pen, the nib just touching a swirl that may be a letter, or may simply be the idea of writing itself. The air shifts, and you catch the faint, sweet dust of crushed leaves, perhaps from the shade cloth above, perhaps from the vines at the wall's edge. A small bird hops along the top of the basin, pecks at something invisible, then flits up to the rim of the chest, before deciding you are not worth the trouble. Its claws leave tiny tracks in the dust along the wood. A quirk rests at the bottom of the chest, a folded scrap of leather, tied with a cord so fine it could be mistaken for thread. You open it to find a fragment of paper pressed between the folds, half a sentence in a hand you don't recognize. The ink is pale, almost gold where the light catches it, and the words are only part of a thought: when the road was wider than the sky. Whether this was meant as verse, memory, or code is unclear. The fragment seems too carefully kept to be mere scrap, but too incomplete to explain itself. Historians still argue whether small collections like this, private, loosely organized, containing more oddities than canonical texts, were common in Timbuktu, or rare luxuries. Some suggest they belonged to apprentices, who used them for practice. Others believe they were the quiet pride of scholars who kept personal notebooks apart from the formal library. The truth may be both, or neither, or something in between that the dust has chosen to keep. You return the bundle to the chest, sliding it beside the others so that the colored cords fall in a neat row. The basin in the courtyard catches a patch of sunlight, the dust inside glowing faintly. A breeze nudges the vines overhead, and for a moment their shadow crosses the basin in a pattern that almost matches the carvings. You stand, brushing dust from your hands. The mat beneath your feet creaks softly with the movement, as though grateful for the company. Beyond the courtyard wall, you hear the faint clap of wooden sandals and the low hum of someone singing to themselves. The sound fades toward another lane, leaving the courtyard still except for the bird, which has returned to the basin's edge to study the dust again. You step back into the narrow passage, the walls warming your shoulders as you pass. Behind you, the chest remains open, its contents breathing in the shaded air, waiting for the next hand to choose which cord to untie. You follow a shallow stair that seems to have been placed more for a thought than for height, a rise of 3 steps, a pause of small landing, a 4th step put there by someone with a sense of humor. At the top, a door waits with its latch tied shut by a loop of pale cord. You recognize the look before your fingers touch it. Not rope, not leather thong, but something whiter, more fibrous, with a soft, sealed sheen. You pinch and feel the slight spring that belongs to sinew. The knot has been tied so the tail tucks back into the loop, clever, reversible, unwilling to make a fuss. Inside, the room holds coolness the way a palm cupped around water does. Shelves run low along 2 walls, and each is lined with neat, rectangular bundles. Every bundle is corseted by a single length of pale cord that crosses itself twice, like a quiet X, and ends in a square knot that sits exactly in the middle, as if it agreed to be the punctuation for the whole thing. When you breathe, you smell dust. That means no harm. Leather that remembers oil, and the faint ghost of something animal that is not musk, not milk more the clean, straw sun smell of tendon, turned into purpose. You choose a bundle with a tie the color of old bone. The cord slides, not like silk, not like string, but like a living thing that has decided to play along. The knot loosens with a small sigh and the cord slips into your palm, warm from the room despite being nothing but preserved thread. Under the wrap lie folios trimmed square, stacked so the edges make a just barely wavy line. The kind that appears only when a patient hand did the cutting with a knife that needed no boasting. A steady fact settles easily here. In Timbuktu, and across the manuscript cultures of the Western Sahel, pages were commonly wrapped in leather and secured with ties. For the ties themselves, households used what the desert offered: twisted plant fiber when it was at hand, leather thongs when there was scrap to spare, and, not rarely, goat or sheep sinew prepared to a narrow, durable cord. Sinew takes a knot like it was invented for the job, and, kept dry, can outlast the voice that taught the knot its steps. You loosen a second bundle and find a different mood. These folios are sewn through one corner with 2 short stitches. The holes neat, the cord passed and returned, so the stack hangs together without the stiffness of a binding. The stitch sits where the thumb would not top left, so every reader avoids it without thinking. You press a fingertip to the cord. It yields and springs back, not elastic, not brittle, just that third thing that makes tools feel handmade and right. The light through the high lattice paints thin ladders up the wall and leaves the cords to glow softly where they cross dark leather. You test one between finger and thumb and feel how the surface is not smooth, but finely ridged, the memory of fiber bundles flattened and twisted. The faintest topography of a life that once pulled bone to bone. It is not morbid. It is practical, like a mat made from palm that once drank sun for a living and now saves you from hot stone. A shallow basket holds offcuts of the same pale cord, short sections, half knots, tails, saved as if a keeper could not stand to throw away anything that might someday become a loop, a tag, a mend. Beside the basket lies a bone tool no longer sharp enough to be a knife and too heavy to be a pen. Its handle is smooth to the gloss of long use. A thin groove runs the length, where cords have been burnished by a hand that loves straight lines. You draw a scrap of sinew through the groove and watch it flatten and shine, made gentler by patience. The folios you open are simple: a list of sales, salt by the block, indigo by the bundle, and a column of numbers that add up like someone who sleeps well calculated them. In the margin, a quick note says, "Tie again after the hot season," which makes you smile at the frankness of it. Even cords need seasons to be reconsidered. You retie the bundle and the knot sits down as if it never left. A quirk slips in, grinning from a corner. On a peg by the door hangs a tiny pouch stitched from scrap leather and labeled in a brisk hand, "For softening." Inside is nothing but a twist of cloth. The cloth, when unrolled, reveals a dab of something the color of weak tea tallow or oil mixed with a trace of resin, perhaps. A fingertip's worth rubbed along a stiff section of sinew teaches it to curve again without complaint. You work a hint of it into a tired knot on one bundle, and the cord answers by remembering how to be kind. Outside, a goat complains once, as if offering professional commentary on the industry that parts it from its more heroic tendons. You offer the room a private apology on behalf of its useful animals and move on. On a shelf by the shaded wall, one stack is tied with a cord darker, browner, less clean in its sheen. You touch and know it is leather thong. Not everything here is made from one material. The city has always used what was at hand and what was timely. Historians still argue whether sinew ties like these were a preferred standard in domestic rooms or simply one of several sensible options, chosen when leather was too dear for cutting thin and imported thread came dearer still. Identifying sinew in surviving bundles can be tricky. Time darkens everything. Oil and dust disguise surfaces, and restorers sometimes replaced older ties with new ones that make tidy sense to the modern eye. Catalogs admit uncertainty with that calm voice they use for things that will not yield to microscopes without being unmade. You lift a final bundle and find folios with small red headings, each ruled carefully with faint lines that must have been drawn against a thread. At the back is an empty page, except for a sentence near the corner in a tiny hand. "Chew here if stiff." The spot bears a faint circle of marks, as though someone followed the instruction in an earlier season. The notion is as practical as it is peculiar. Softening a sinew tie by wetting it sometimes, with nothing more complex than a scribe's own mouth, before coaxing the knot free. A fringe habit perhaps, but in a dry city, any fiber learns to accept kindness delivered however it arrives. You sit with that odd advice a moment longer than you need to. The room indulges the pause. The cords do not mind being noticed. You imagine the routine on a long afternoon. Pull a bundle. If the knot resists, touch the pouch, or if the pouch is empty, a breath on the cord. If that fails, well, chew here if stiff. Work and humor are old neighbors. On a side shelf, a thin stick polished at one end and split at the other rests beside a folded cloth. The split end can catch a cord and guide it through a tight crossing. The polished end can nudge a knot into place without marking it. Next to it sits a palm leaf label with 2 words only, "After sand." You understand, the sinuous grit that walks in with wind will find cords first. After a storm, ties must be checked, dust teased out, loops persuaded to move again before they set their minds against change. A steady fact walks with you as you retie the bundles. Households here were not only readers, but keepers of technique. How to twist, how to soften, how to knot in a way that could be undone by the next person without swearing. Knowledge survives in the cord as surely as in the page it protects. A good knot is legible. You close the last wrap and trace the pale X where cord crosses cord. The knot sits in the center like a small, patient star. The room smells the same as when you entered leather after a cool night, paper after a long rest, and the faintest echo of pasture turned into line. You loop the latch outside with a length of sinew the color of fresh bread's crumb and seat the knot with a gentle pull. It looks like it has always lived there. When you step back into the stairs' shallow light, the goat down the lane has forgotten its complaint. A dry leaf skitters by and snags the step as if it has found an old friend. You touch your sleeve and find a pale fiber clinging, bright against the cloth. It will ride with you a little while and then choose its own place to depart, which is exactly how threads prefer to travel with dignity, at their pace, leaving small, tidy stories behind them. You step into a room that glows without light, and it takes a moment to name why. The pages here carry red. Not much, just enough to make the black sit up straighter. On the low shelf, a manuscript lies open where a hand left it mid-breath. Lines of dark script walk the page in their measured stride, and between them, at the head of each new section, a quiet band of scarlet says, "Begin here." The red is not loud. It is the tone a teacher uses when the room has already decided to listen. You kneel and let the page meet you halfway. The headings are short, 2, 3 words, then a slender line drawn beneath them in the same red, as if to tuck the thought in before the black continues. Smaller marks appear in the margins, tiny letters, numbers, and occasional dots, each one a pause sign, a cue, a memory hook. The red has aged into the color of baked clay rinsed after rain. It still holds its nerve. Rubrication is ordinary here. That is its elegance. A steady fact. In Islamic manuscript traditions across North and West Africa, red inks commonly marked titles, section breaks, key terms, or helped guide recitation. Scribes in and around Timbuktu used it to separate a commentary from the base text and to steer a student's eye to the next step. You trace a red line with your gaze and feel how kindly it behaves, never pushing, always pointing. On the work table, a shallow bowl holds the remnants of such intention. The interior is stained in 2 rings, the deeper circle near the center where the brush or reed met the mixture, and a paler tide line where red once dried when the bowl was left to rest. Beside it, a fragment of palm leaf bears Test's short strokes in 3 shades: brick, ember, rose. Someone has been deciding which red belongs to which page, the way a cook chooses salt by grain rather than by name. You lift the bowl and catch a faint mineral scent. It is not sweet, not sour, closer to stone nudged by rain. A small folded paper nearby holds a dust the color of crushed pottery, red earth or a pigment ground fine, waiting for gum and water. Another slip, stained half pink, suggests a recipe in a line and a half. Powder gum, a breath more water than for black. A breath is not a measure, except that it is. You smile at the accuracy of vagueness passed down in kitchens and copy rooms both. A slender reed trimmed to a broader nib lies across a cloth. Its tip bears a blush that will not wash. The fibers have memorized the pigment. Beside it sits a finer pen, still tipped with black partners who do not argue. You imagine the tempo. Black for the body of the thought, red for its headings, back to black for its bones. The rhythm becomes the page's heartbeat. You rest your fingers on the margin and can almost feel it. You turn one leaf and find red used differently. Small circles, neat as seeds, tucked above certain words, and a thin vertical line running like a quiet fence along the start of a paragraph. The circles are not decoration. They collect a set of terms the teacher promised to revisit. In the outer margin, a red letter repeats in sequence Aleph, Ba, Jim, each marking a step in an argument that wanted its own staircase. The letter shapes look slightly rounder than those in the main text, as if drawn by a wrist relaxed on purpose. A modest quirk waits in the lower corner. A thumbprint in red, not black, where someone turned too soon or tested a brush and forgot themselves. The whirl is delicate, a ghost spiral pressed into the very place where a reader's thumb would land centuries later. You raise your own thumb, consider the symmetry, and decide not to add conversation to the print. The script itself, its black, wears a local confidence. Letters standing a little wide, certain loops scrolled open, tails settling low before they rise. The style whispers Sudani to a patient eye. The Maghribi family written in a hand, taught by teachers who learned in shade and carried their lines home through dust. The red obeys that hand, never fighting for shape, always following the rules the black has set. Historians still argue whether the red marginal symbols in West African manuscripts were always the work of the original scribe, or often added later by teachers as finding aids for students. Some folios show the red laid beneath the black, as if underdrawing the plan. Others clearly wear red added after, slipping between words like a soft correction. The page in front of you offers both. Headings unquestionably planned, side marks that feel like thoughts arriving a season later, when a classroom discovered where questions like to gather. On a small tray near the window sits a second bowl, this one stained a different red cooler, almost tending to rust. A paler ring shows where liquid once hesitated. Tucked under the bowl is a note with a single word, ochre. It is an honest pigment, pulled from the patience of earth. Another folded scrap reads, cinnabar? With a question mark neat enough to be a raised eyebrow. Perhaps someone had a pinch of the bright mineral once and wondered if it belonged here or in an amulet, either way. Not a common guest in rooms that prefer materials from the nearest horizon. You think of other recipes you have seen or been told in rooms like this. Red coaxed from powdered brick washed many times, from clay chosen at a river's elbow, from safflower coaxed past its own reluctance, from henna's stubborn green-brown warmth. Each can be persuaded into a red that minds its manners on paper. A city of practical alchemies does not boast. It makes, in the margin of a legal passage, a teacher's red hand has planted tiny anchors, short ticks at line, ends to keep a beginner's eye from sliding past pauses. The effect is gentle, like a finger at the place in the book while the student repeats the sentence. A steady fact, rubrication served pedagogy as much as ornament. It made a landscape for reading, so the mind could walk the text without tripping. A breeze slips the lattice, and the page lifts, a small bow of agreement. You notice, at the head of the next section, a red word that has been carefully scraped away and rewritten. The first ghost of the word remains pale and abraded, while the corrected red sits bright above it like a remembered name finally put in its rightful place. The scrape marks glint faintly where the paper's surface was polished back down with a smooth bone. The repair is tidy and unashamed. Another uncertainty takes a chair beside you. Along the outer edge runs a series of red dots, not vowels, not the usual diacriticals, spaced at seemingly regular intervals. Are they pacing markers for public reading, breath counts for chanting, or merely a scribe's way of tallying lines to calculate payment or plan the next choir? Scholars still argue, and the page, courteous as ever, offers nothing but its dots and its silence. You close the folio a little, letting it rest with the red headings peeking like ribbon spines. The room holds its color even with the book asleep. On the work table, the ring in the bowl has already dried, a shade lighter, and a tiny chip of pigment has settled in the corner like a seed deciding whether to root. Before you go, you dampen the tip of the cloth with a single drop from the water jar and touch it to a grain of dried red at the bowl's edge. It darkens obediently to a tiny ember and then fades. The smell is nothing, and then a hint of stone again. You set the cloth down so it can forget what you ask it to do. When you step back into the lane, the world looks briefly rubricated door lintels as headings, shadows as underlines, people moving in the black text of the day with small errands marked in red. The illusion passes, but a trace remains. Your eye keeps finding the place to begin, the place to pause, and the place to breathe. A city taught by pages teaches the street as well. The next doorway opens onto a room that smells faintly of dust warmed by wool. The shelves here are lined not with bound codices or flat folios, but with rolled manuscripts, tight spirals of paper or parchment, each secured with a loop of cord, a strip of cloth, or a narrow band of leather. They lean together in rows, their ends facing outward like the cores of many quiet shells. The light from the high window falls across their spirals, tracing soft shadows in each hollow. You reach for one near the middle. The roll is firmer than it looks, the outer edge slightly darkened from handling. A knot of cord slips free with a single pull, and the paper opens into a slow curl that resists just enough to remind you it prefers this shape. Inside, the script marches steadily from left to right, the lines slightly diagonal from the tension of rolling. Marginal notes lean uphill like small shrubs on a windy slope. A steady fact: rolled manuscripts were far from unusual in West African scholarly practice, while bound books and stitched quires dominated for formal works, letters, contracts, and some teaching texts often lived as scrolls. Rolling allowed long, unbroken columns of script and was practical for storage, especially in households where space was claimed by many kinds of work. The scroll you hold contains a series of short commentaries, each marked by a red heading and separated by a space wide enough to rest your thumb. Between two commentaries, a strip of woven cloth has been pasted along the margin, perhaps to reinforce a weak point in the paper. The cloth is patterned faintly with diagonal lines, dyed a dusty yellow that may once have been brighter. On the floor beneath the lowest shelf sits a shallow wooden tray, its surface crowded with small pebbles. At first glance, they seem only ballast to keep the tray from shifting, but tucked among them are fragments of reed pen stubs, cut at different angles, some stained black, others red, one with a faint green line that stops mid-nib. Perhaps the tray served as a resting place for writing tools too short to use but too fine to throw away. You unroll another manuscript, this one narrower and lighter. The paper has been folded once lengthwise before rolling, giving it a small ridge down the middle. On its outer edge, someone has written a brief label, 2 words, just large enough to read without untying. The ink is faded, the letters slightly smudged, but the meaning is clear. A quick title for quick retrieval. You picture a scholar reaching for exactly this scroll with one hand, while steadying another bundle with the other, pulling the knot loose in a single motion. The room's quiet is broken by a faint rustle. On the top shelf, a small lizard is paused on the warm wood, its tail draped across the spine of a rolled parchment. It watches you with stillness that feels deliberate, then disappears between 2 rows without disturbing their neatness. A quirk lies in the corner of the lowest shelf, a rolled manuscript tied not with cord, but with a thin strip of braided hair dark, with a single thread of white woven through. Whether this was sentimental, practical, or simply what was at hand is not recorded. The braid is fine and even, the knot a small, perfect loop that holds without pulling tight. You leave it untouched. Historians still argue whether the choice between binding and rolling in Timbuktu was purely practical or sometimes symbolic. Some suggest certain legal documents were rolled for formality. Others claim rolls were simply the fastest way to store a long sheet without trimming or stitching. Surviving examples show both casual and elaborate use, making the distinction hazy. On a low table rests an empty core, a thin stick of tamarisk wood around which paper must once have been rolled. Its surface is polished smooth from the turning of many hands, the faint grain still visible beneath the gloss. You imagine the unrolling, the reading, the careful re-rolling until the paper sat just as it had before. Near the window, a clay jar sits with its lid slightly ajar. Inside are narrow strips of parchment, each rolled so tightly they resemble small beads. These may be sample texts for teaching short verses or proverbs, ready to be unrolled, recited, and rolled again by a student's hand. The jar's interior smells faintly of dust and something else, perhaps the memory of the skin before it was parchment. You replace the scroll in your hands, coaxing it back into its shape, the outer edge curling in as though grateful for the return. The knot settles with a small twist of the cord. From the doorway, you glance back at the rows, dozens of spirals waiting in their quiet alignment, each holding words that will not rush to unfold, no matter the reader's impatience. Stepping out into the lane, you hear a distant call, someone summoning a friend, or perhaps calling across to the next courtyard. The sound drifts between the walls like a word unrolling slowly from the mouth. You follow its echo until it folds into the city's steady hum. The lane curves and delivers you to a doorway without a door, only a hanging strip of thick cloth that brushes your shoulder as you step inside. The room is small, square, and dim, its walls coated with a pale lime wash that seems to drink what little light comes through the high vent. A low table runs along one wall, covered with neat stacks of folded paper. Each stack is topped with a small, flat stone to keep the sheets from drifting in the occasional gust. You sit before one of the piles and lift the stone. Beneath it, the top sheet bears a line of script so pale it looks like a shadow of writing rather than writing itself. You tilt it toward the light and see faint silver-gray letters that shimmer briefly before vanishing back into the page. The ink is not faded, it was always this color, a tone that sits somewhere between memory and intention. A steady fact. Among Timbuktu's manuscript traditions, not all inks were the deep blacks and reds most often imagined. Some scholars and copyists prepared lighter inks from diluted soot or plant dyes, using them for annotation, for undertext meant to be read only in certain contexts, or as a training exercise for new scribes to practice without producing pages too bold to reuse. Beside the pale script lies a sheet with a different experiment letters written in alternating colors, black, then red, then something greenish, brown. The pattern continues for only a few lines before settling back into black, as if the scribe was testing materials and decided mid-sentence which one would behave. A single green letter near the margin has bled faintly into the paper, its halo soft but still visible. On a shelf near the far wall sits a collection of tiny ceramic cups, each holding what remains of a different pigment. One cup's contents have hardened into a solid disc. Another holds a soft pile of powder that shifts when you breathe near it. A scrap of paper tucked between them lists names in a column, some clear, lamp soot, red earth, others more elusive, desert rain, sparrow wing. The latter may be metaphors, may be code, or may simply be the kind of shorthand that made sense to the hand that wrote it. You lean over to examine a set of reed pens resting on a folded cloth. Their nibs are cut to different widths, each tip stained in a unique tone: coal black, rusty red, mossy green. The cloth beneath them is spotted with tiny marks where the pens were tested. A few strokes resemble letters. Others are just lines, widening and narrowing as if measuring the reed's obedience. A quirk reveals itself in the stack at the far end of the table. A sheet covered entirely in tiny script, so small that a whole paragraph fits within the space of a handprint. The text is perfectly formed, the lines ruler straight, the letters so compressed they look like a secret the paper agreed to keep. Turning it over, you find the same density on the reverse, as though this was an exercise in seeing how much thought could be persuaded into the smallest space. Historians still argue whether certain unusual inks, particularly green, were ever widely used in Timbuktu, or whether their presence in surviving manuscripts is the result of later repairs or foreign editions. Some green pigments are notoriously unstable, fading to brown or black over time. Others may have been made from plant extracts that simply do not survive centuries of handling and heat. At the edge of the table lies a shallow wooden frame strung with threads like a miniature loom. Tiny strips of paper are woven between the threads, each strip holding a single word or symbol. Perhaps it is a teaching tool, or perhaps it was used to test the legibility of inks from a distance. The strips vary in color, some a warm cream, others faintly blue, one with a pinkish hue that stands out among the rest. You take another sheet from the nearest stack and find a margin filled with tiny dots in several colors. They are not aligned with the text. Instead, they scatter like seeds, each in a slightly different tone: black, red, gray, and once a pale blue that seems almost accidental. Whether these were tests, mistakes, or a kind of coded notation, the page refuses to say. The air in the room is still, heavy with the quiet work of centuries. You realize that most of what surrounds you here was not meant to impress, but to function, to test, to measure, to decide what would carry thought onto the page. The city's great libraries were not only vaults for finished works, they were also workshops, laboratories, where the tools of thought were tried and improved. You replace the stone atop the stack, its weight reassuring in its modesty. The cloth at the doorway stirs faintly as you pass back into the lane, leaving behind a room where the inks still wait, each in its own small cup. For the moment, a hand will choose it. The lane narrows until the walls seem to fold toward each other, and then widens again into a small courtyard. The ground is swept clean, except for a scattering of date pits near the base of a fig tree. The shade here is complete, the kind of shade that makes you slow without thinking. Against the far wall stands a low structure of mud brick and plaster, its roof of palm fronds layered thick enough to turn away the noon heat. You step inside without needing to knock. This is a place for pages, not for privacy. The air is cool and smells faintly of cedar. Along the left wall, a wooden chest sits open, its lid propped with a stick. Inside are folded leather wraps, each containing a small stack of manuscripts. The wraps are soft from years of handling, their edges worn smooth, the ties knotted simply. You lift one and feel the flecks of paper, within neither stiff nor fragile, just quietly ready to be read. A steady fact: cedar wood and cedar oil were sometimes used in manuscript storage in Timbuktu and elsewhere, both for their pleasant scent and their tendency to discourage insects. Even where cedar itself was scarce, merchants brought oil or shavings to line boxes and chests. The scent lingers for years, weaving itself into the paper until the book and the wood are indistinguishable in smell. You open the wrap and find a series of folios on astronomy. The diagrams are simple circles drawn in black, with occasional notations in red. One shows a ring divided into 12 parts, each labeled with an Arabic term for a zodiac sign. The lines are neat but unornamented, the work of a hand more interested in accuracy than display. In the corner, a small star has been drawn in gold, its points just slightly uneven, as though the scribe allowed a moment of pleasure to override the compass. Beside the chest sits a small clay jar with a lid carved from bone. You lift it and catch the faint resinous scent of gum arabic. A tiny reed spoon rests beside it, its bowl worn shallow from years of measuring. This gum, mixed with water, would have bound pigment to page. Dry, it keeps to itself, a quiet reminder of its role in the city's work. On the opposite wall, a narrow shelf holds rolled cloths, dust covers for manuscripts. Some are plain, others embroidered at the edges with simple patterns in faded thread. One cloth bears a stitched line of script, perhaps a prayer or the name of the household. The thread is worn in places, the words breaking and resuming like speech across a courtyard. A quirk reveals itself on a lower shelf, a single folded page, not part of any volume, pressed flat beneath a smooth stone. It contains a list of household items, each with a number beside it: bowls, lamps, looms. At the bottom, in a smaller hand, someone has added 3 books, 1 missing. Whether the note was meant as a reminder, a lament, or a prompt for search is unknown. Historians still argue whether cedar was imported specifically for manuscript preservation in Timbuktu, or whether its use here was simply an extension of broader household habits. Cedar chests also stored clothing, textiles, and valuables. The books may have been sharing space with other treasured goods, their preservation an incidental benefit of living alongside the things people wish to keep close. You set the astronomy folios back into their wrap, folding the leather over them and tying the cord in a loose, practiced knot. The chest receives them without complaint. You close the lid but leave the stick in place. The air should still move, even in safekeeping. Outside, the fig tree's shade has shifted slightly, the pits now lying in a small crescent of light. A pigeon coos somewhere above, and the faint clink of a water jar comes from a nearby doorway. You take the curve of the lane away from the courtyard, feeling the cedar scent still caught in your sleeves. The libraries are never truly lost. You think only waiting in their corners, breathing at their own pace, letting the city's sound and scent settle into their pages until the next hand comes to turn them. You walk slowly now, the heat softened by the hour, the air holding that quiet weight it gets before evening. The lanes are narrower here, the walls higher, and every so often, a doorway stands open just enough to let you glimpse a cool room, a folded mat, a low shelf with a few books leaning against each other. No one hurries. Your steps fall into the city's rhythm: stone, dust, shadow, light. Somewhere, a metal pan is being tapped clean with the side of a spoon. A child calls, is answered, calls again, the voice turning into something almost like song. The smell of baking bread drifts between the walls and mingles with the faint sweetness of drying figs. You pass a wall painted with a faded design, geometric, but softened by years until it looks more like the memory of pattern than pattern itself. A cat sleeps beneath it, one paw tucked under its chin. Its breathing matches the pace of your own without meaning to. There are no grand signs here, no sudden revelations. The pages you have seen, the bindings and rolls and inks and knots, they all continue without you, the way water continues under a stone. They are not waiting to be discovered. They are simply being, as they have always been, keeping their shape in a city that understands the slow keeping of things. You turn down one last lane. The light is lower now, the air cooler, and somewhere close by a door closes with the sound of wood fitting perfectly into wood. You breathe once more the mingled scents of paper, leather, dust, and cedar, and let them settle into the back of your mind where they will keep. The libraries rest. The city rests. You rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.